Good evening. It is 5:30 p.m. here in the Mona Lisa Drexler Assembly Chambers, and I'm going to call the October 4, 2018 Assembly Finance Committee to order. Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Yes, thank you. I would like to note for the record that Mr. Tackey is excused tonight. Mr. Gray.
Here.
Ms. Dodge. Here. Mr. Lawrence.
Here.
Ms. Major. Mr. Roberts.
Here.
Mr. Lejeski.
Here.
Mr. Quist.
Here.
Mr. Cooper.
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right, thank you. Quick safety announcement before we begin. In the event of an emergency, there are 3 marked exits from the assembly chambers. Find the closest, safest exit to you. They're in the back of the room with the red exit signs, and they will lead you to safety. We have no memoranda reports or presentations tonight, and no contracts or bid awards. So our first item will be advanced ordinances and resolutions. And the first ordinance is ordinance number 2018-20-1I, an ordinance amending the FY 2018-19 budget by appropriating $1,683,000 from the Solid Waste Disposal Enterprise Operating Fund unrestricted net position to the Solid Waste Disposal Enterprise Projects Funds for solid waste facility perimeter maintenance. The sponsor is Mayor Castle. There's information at page 3. Mayor Castle.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Bob Jordan from Public Works.
Thank you and good evening. So I have an 11-slide PowerPoint. Emphasis on short, okay? Let me make sure it's started. Okay, so this is a perimeter maintenance project report. Emphasis on perimeter, so it's the outside edges of the landfill facility. Fences, ditches, culverts, and some roads. It was prepared for us by our consultant, HDR Inc., this past summer, where we literally, with an on-site visit, 2 of them and 2 of us spent the afternoon walking around the entire perimeter. We looked at it to identify the needs and conditions of the perimeter items, and we looked at it on a long-term basis with like a 40-year plus time horizon. So that is an aerial photo of the landfill facility taken just over a year ago. And it encompasses 252 acres. A little parentheses there, 1 acre is 43,560 square feet. You're going to want to know that number here in a few minutes.
Is that a test?
No, because the answer will be on here anyway.
Open book.
Oh, good.
Open PowerPoint. So to the north is Lakeview Terrace Trailer Park, just to give you a little idea of a reference for those of you that have not been out there. The gray-white dashed lines represents our perimeter or property border. Off to the west is our construction and demolition disposal area. To the east is our municipal solid waste disposal area. And then down towards the corner with that red border is cell 3. It's currently our active area, and it's approximately 18 acres. And that blue rectangular area represents a football field, which is about 48,000 square feet. So it's approximately the same, slightly larger than a football field. Trying to give you a reference there on size and scale. And if you're curious, about 16 football fields fit into cell 3, and I think I figured out it was 228 football fields fit into the entire area. Just trying to give you an idea of the scope and the magnitude of the facility. And as part of that on-site survey we did last summer, we took some photos. I've got 5 total to follow with photo number 1. Let me find this pointer here. Up on the northeast side of the landfill, bordering the railroad tracks, which run left to right here. Photo number 2 just slightly off to the east. Photo 3 is going to take you down in the southwest corner along the levee, which runs right along here. Photo number 4 on the western border. Northland Wood is on that edge, along with the 5th and final photo just a little bit south of that. Okay. In each of these photos, the idea behind them is they just represent some conditions and type of work that's needed. Okay. So photo number 1, you can see we have to have some brush clearing next to this for access next to the fence, and to do or complete any fence repairs or replacements that may be necessary. A little closer look, you can see that the fence, this is on that northern side, northwestern side again, is damaged. It's probably been vandalized, probably by some access by some individuals. The fence posts itself are leaning over, and you can see it's choked full of brush and trees and things like that. You can see the 2 red arrows. If you look closely, they're pointing at 2 fence posts here and here. They're leaning backwards. They're surrounded by brush. And if you actually had walked a little bit to the left or a little bit to the east, the fence actually is down in that section there. Now we have gone back and temporarily cleared out a little bit of the brush and just propped it back up, but it's pretty ugly looking. It's just barely hanging vertical, and I'll explain a little bit why we did that in a few minutes. And this is indicative of many areas of the fencing around the perimeter border caused by the brush, also caused by, there's a lot of water and swamp area in this section as well. Photo number 4. There's a couple things I wanted to point out here. You have a road that appears to be just fine and in good shape, and it is on the surface. However, over the years it's encroached or widened out just from the truck traffic and from the grading and other efforts. You can't quite see, but on the upper side, my next photo will show this, there's the whole ditch system that's essentially filled in, so the stormwater, the surface water doesn't flow at all, and the culvert system, as you see, is pretty much compromised. And on the lower side, you can see how the fence is pushing into these bollards or barricades, which there's actually a steel plate running across and between them to protect this groundwater well that's right there. And we want to pull what we want to do here is we want to pull back this road or narrow this road up, pull in the sides, narrow it back up to a reasonable driving width, and reestablish that ditch on the upper side, as well as reestablishing this ditch on the lower side, and then providing some sort of a ramp or access way to get down from this elevation down to this elevation, down to these wells. It doesn't look quite as bad, but it's a drop of about 3 to 4 feet. In fact, last Saturday I just about fell flat on my face as I was coming back out on there because I got caught on some of the brush. And then, of course, we want to have the ability to get to this fence over here, do any clearing, repairing, and replacement that is necessary. These wells here, there's about 3 along this perimeter. There's others around other locations around the facility. There are groundwater wells, gas monitoring wells. We have to access those between either a quarterly basis or twice-a-year basis. You got to get there and close to them with generators, sampling equipment, and other things. And just to make it easy, since we're going to be doing this for quite a few number of years. And finally, there's that picture of that culvert. You might have to look closely. It's right there. So here's the road here that's sort of pushed out from the edge, sort of filled in, and it looks like it might have gotten crunched there a little bit as well. So why do we care? Or what are we trying to resolve? What kind of solutions are we trying to look for? One is the State of Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation issues us an operating permit. Part of that permit, they do an annual inspection, and in that inspection they give us comments back, and one of the things they've been dinging on us for a number of years is that fencing, especially in that southern area that's laying flat. And that's because we need to have our perimeter secured, not only for that purpose, but also to help protect our facility and our buildings and our equipment that we have there. Be nice to have some functioning gates, not only the ones in the front that the residents use, or sorry, the public uses, but also our residential gate or employee gate, but also the gates and the fencing that's in the back half that we use for access by contractors during our various projects that we have. I mentioned a little bit about the road maintenance and the need for that. I mentioned a little bit about the stormwater drainage or the lack of in some areas. And there's a couple places on the south side the fence, or sorry, the road actually floods every spring. We can't even get through it. So we need to redirect the surface water, maybe raise the road a little bit, reestablish the ditches and culverts. And I mentioned well access earlier. And finally is the future construction and demolition landfill. The current area has about 6 years left. So we're getting to the end. We want to figure out where we want to go next. And we've actually started on that. We should hopefully have an answer by midwinter or so. But we're wanting to develop that new construction debris area sooner to save as much space as we can in that old area and reserve that remaining space for asbestos disposal here. And in order to do that, we have to be able to get to our perimeter areas within the facility. So our consultant prepared us a cost estimate, 1.6, 1.7 million. It covers surveying, fencing, gravel, culverts, design fees, project management, contingency, and the total is the 1.6. And the funding would be coming from the Solid Waste Disposal Enterprise Fund. And with that should be the 11th slide, and I'll take any questions.
All right, let's see if there's committee discussion. So I have Ms. Dodge, then Mr. Lejeski.
So I sound like it's my turn to sound like Mr. Roberts. I have quite a few questions here. So how many years have we been getting dinged for this?
It's about 3. I mean, our inspection is based on 100%. We're usually end up about 95, 96, 98%, somewhere in there each year. It's just a comment that they make, but we've told them that we were going to get to it. We just haven't been able to up until this point.
And do you brush annually or anything of that nature?
Some areas in the center part we do on the hillsides. We brush that, but some of these areas on the edge is beyond our equipment and beyond our ability. It's either swamps or so ingrown that we can't get in there and do much effective brushing at this point. We feel we're going to need to actually remove the fence, maybe establish some sort of a gravel base, and then replace the fence or reinstall the fence.
And when was this maintained last? When did we do?
It sort of depends. There's an area, let me go back to, one moment here. So this area, for example, along this edge here, I was put in initially in about 97 or 98, somewhere in that time frame. I remember about 8, 9 years ago as I walked this area, it had completely fallen over. It's in the swampy area. And the post frost jack up and fell over. It got fixed again as part, I think, of the Cell 3-4 project, which would have been about 4 years ago or so.
Can I ask one last question?
Sure.
So my really big question is, you talked about this being a 40-year timeline. We have a cell that has 6 years left.
Okay, this...
So the landfills and the entire landfill's lifespan is what? Expected lifespan?
2060, 2065, somewhere in there.
Thank you.
Mr. Lejeski.
I was curious, how much money do we have in the enterprise operating fund there?
Okay. So I've worked with finance recently on this. Remember, the last audited year is FY17. FY18 just finished, and it's pending the audit. So I've got a number back from FY17. Let me see here. So the presentation here is always is an enterprise fund, general fund is the general fund. We call under the enterprise fund a net position as opposed to the term fund balance, but let's just use them interchangeably for tonight. The fund balance on the general fund basis, which looks at current assets and current liabilities, is 17 million. Okay, that's looking at just the current items. On a net position, looking at the entire picture, I don't have those numbers with me tonight. So I think I'm partially answering your question. I'm partially not.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to figure out, I mean, the basic question, I assume it's yes, but it is, do we have $1.7 million hitting around?
All right, so
That's the
I
first
asked,
one.
I worked with finance from that question from 2 different perspectives. One, I've worked on it from the standpoint of our long-range forecast that you probably have heard about before. It's the 20-year analysis, 20-year time horizon analysis that looks at tonnages, current tonnages and projected tonnages, looks at the associated tipping fees, which would generate revenue for the facility. It looks at, the various anticipated expenses from personnel, commodities, contractual items, as well as the equipment purchases, capital projects, and so forth. Looks at all the expenses associated with solid waste. As an enterprise fund, it's supposed to generate sufficient revenues to cover its expenditures. I've placed in that long-range forecast these particular appropriating ordinance to see if there's sufficient funding to pay for them. That's one way I've looked at it. And I also worked with a member of the finance department, sort of to check as my numbers. I prepared them, but I wanted somebody independent of me to take a look at them.
Okay, that could make sense depending on how this is being financed. I thought this was a cash appropriation, so it'd be like a one-time movement of money, and we're not financing this into the future against future cash flows?
The funding would come from the solid waste disposal fund net position is where it comes from.
Which presumably has a pile of cash or cash equivalents or some sort of short-term assets.
Yes, there's cash in the solid waste facility fund, balanced by the fact that there's long-term liabilities, closure and post-closure liabilities with the fund as well. So I believe the finance department periodically provides to the assembly a general fund analysis utilizing when they're determining whether there's a sufficient appropriation or sufficient balance out of that fund. Finance prepared a similar document for me, which is like a mock-up of the general fund, or as if similar type analysis as that. And that mock-up looks at current assets and current liabilities, meaning everyday, daily items, and is there enough money to fund this kind of appropriation? That analysis was done. There's the target reserve that's in the borough policy on the percent of fund balance should be available, 17%. I'm hoping this rings a bell with some.
General fund target.
Yeah, and I used the same, or finance used that same target percentage of 17%, which says we should have a minimum fund balance of 2.2 million. And we have about 14 million, basing it upon at the end of 6/30/17, which is the last audited year.
Okay, so at that point in time, we had a $14 million net current asset position.
Fund balance position.
Okay. All right, I think I've taken enough time here.
Thanks. And maybe, Mr. Jordan, if you have something that finance prepared regarding the solid waste disposal enterprise operating fund net position that you can share with the assembly, or something from finance to help answer Mr. Lejeski's question that you can send us, that would be helpful.
Or would you like me to see if maybe Mrs. Brady could come next week? I talked to her about this a little bit with Diane Borgeson as well. So would that be sufficient as well?
Either one. If
Yeah.
it's something that's easy over email, that's great. If they'd like to help answer that question next
Okay.
week, that'd be great too. So next I have Mr. Gray, then Ms. Dodge, and Mr. Lawrence.
I'm good. My question was asked and answered.
All right, Ms. Dodge.
I was just, this is actually to the administration and may or may not be appropriate, but we had asked before, I believe Mr. Roberts asked that we start having a balance when we're taking money from the funds, that we note on somewhere in the packet what the balance is left in that fund, and I just wanted to make that request again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Lawrence.
The revenue going into the solid waste disposal enterprise operating fund, is that tipping fees?
Primarily, the revenue is from tipping fees, correct.
I mean, what else is it?
A little bit of interest, a little bit of miscellaneous income, a little bit of income from our recycling HHW operation. That's pretty much it.
So the schedule of tipping fees that we've been implementing, which is, a $2 increase every year or so, is based upon anticipated expenses going out, those closure and post-closure expenses. So this project here is, it's factored in. I mean, this isn't a surprise for you guys.
Yes, it's factored in, and no, it's not a surprise.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Quist.
So my question's along the same line of Mr. Lawrence's. How much of this, and maybe this isn't a question for this week, maybe next week, but how much of this approximately 17 million in this fund do you imagine is encumbered for future cell closure, maintenance, regulatory compliance, decades down the road?
Okay. So why don't I plan on either asking Mrs. Brady to join us next week or provide some information for next
Thank you.
week? Okay.
Mr. Quist, Ms. Dodge.
And my question's kind of along that same line, and that is, it sounds like maybe you have a planned maintenance schedule in your head and in your office, and maybe we could see that.
Maintenance schedule for what in particular?
The solid waste facility. It sounds like you've got, different projects that are coming our way over the next 10 to 20 years, and if we could see that, I think that would be useful. Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
Additional discussion on this ordinance? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Jordan, but I think you're here for the next one, too.
Yeah. Change hands.
Speaking of more maintenance, the next ordinance is 2018-20-1J, an ordinance amending the FY 2018-19 budget by appropriating $1,570,000 from the Solid Waste Disposal Enterprise Operating Fund unrestricted net position to the Solid Waste Disposal Enterprise Projects Fund for the replacement or rebuild of heavy equipment. Sponsor is Mayor Castle. Information is at page 9. Mayor Castle.
No surprise, we'll go back to Mr. Jordan.
Okay, thank you. So good evening again. This is the second ordinance on the heavy equipment replacement or rebuild. So I'm requesting funding for 3 pieces of heavy equipment that are used in daily operations. The first is one of 3 landfill compactors that we have on site, and it's a 2009 model that has about 12,500 hours. And we've been using it recently as a backup compactor to the two other compactors that we have. So in times when something's down for maintenance or something is down for repairs, we pull out this backup compactor and shift it into operations. So we are looking or proposing to rebuild this compactor and switch it and have it become a primary compactor when it's complete. So we approached the vendor and asked them for an estimate to rebuild this compactor, and they provided us that with the amount of $615,000, and that's the number that's in the ordinance. And then we compared that rebuild estimate to the price of a new one. Now, if you compare it to the price of a different brand compactor, there's a savings of about $200,000. If you compare it to a like brand compactor, the savings is about $400,000. The second piece of equipment is a large bulldozer. It's a 2008 model with about 12,000 hours on it. And it was actually replaced in 2017, or approximately 2 years ago, where it was taken out of service. However, it was never actually surplus, which is what I typically do in those cases. 1, just never got around to it, and 2, the Denali Borough expressed an interest in buying it, and then they were going to rebuild it themselves and use it. However, that never went anywhere. So I look at this bulldozer sitting in the South 40 as an opportunity to rebuild it at a lower cost than a new one, and then use that as a backup bulldozer. So in times when our main one is down or for repairs or maintenance, we have another bulldozer to go ahead and provide the service to the public. So again, we approached the vendor for an estimate, a rebuild estimate. That was $435,000. That's the number that's in the ordinance. And comparing that to the price of a new one, which is about $925,000, or just under $500,000 savings. If you think back about 4 or 5 years ago, I had an ordinance for about 6 pieces of equipment, all as one group. And one of those was to rebuild one of our existing compactors. That was the first time we had ever done it. We wanted to try it to see how it would work, and we had the opportunity to do it because we had another compactor to use in the meantime. It will take 2 or 3 months for a compactor or a piece of equipment to get rebuilt. We had pretty good luck with it, and at significantly lower cost. But I do want to point out this would be an additional piece of equipment that we'd be retaining or rebuilding, and then use it as a backup over time in conjunction with the one that we already have. Finally, we have, and these two items we would hope or anticipate that they would be completed this winter and be ready for use by next summer. And finally, the third item is a replacement of a small bulldozer. Emphasis on replacement, not rebuild. We currently have a 2014 bulldozer. It's got about 7,600 hours on it. And we want to just get the funding in place and actually delay the actual replacement until the end of 2019, 2020, somewhere in that time frame, about a year, 2 years out, depending on the actual use of our existing one and how many hours that we can accumulate on that. And the replacement estimate for that is about $520,000. So a total of these three items is about 1.5, 1.6 million, and again, it would come out of the Solid Waste Disposal Enterprise Fund, and obviously it's one combined ordinance as opposed to three individual ordinances. It means I come to the Assembly with 3 different meetings as opposed to be 9 different meetings. So, and with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, I think we have a few. So I'll start with Mr. Lawrence, then Mr. Roberts, and Ms. Dodge.
Bob, the backup large bulldozer, you said you want it for a backup. Does the main do you have a backup for the big bulldozer or the large one now?
We do not. And that becomes a problem at times when it does go down for something more than, say, a routine maintenance of a couple hours. We're maybe down for a week or two and we don't have that piece of equipment in our operations.
And what's the consequence of that if you don't have a large bulldozer?
Sometimes we have to delay projects coming in from the public. Sometimes we just can't get to particular areas. We try to use a compactor for pushing, or we try to use our small bulldozer for pushing, and it just doesn't work quite as well.
And one last question. This replacement of the small bulldozer, you're saying you're looking for authorization now, but you don't anticipate doing this for a year or so, a year and a half. What's the, other than reducing the amount of times you have to come to this assembly, what's the point of that? Why are we doing three pieces of equipment at once? Is it just to reduce the amount of workload?
It's overall efficiency. It's drafting ordinances, it's attending assembly meetings, it's giving presentations, it's planning out for 2 years worth of equipment purchases or rebuilds as opposed to just doing it on an annual basis. It allows the flexibility that, let's just say we use this bulldozer more hours per year than I anticipate. I'd have the funding in place to go ahead and start the replacement process. A little bit of all those things combined.
All right, thank you.
And it, maybe one last thing, it simply just takes the money from the enterprise funds and puts it into a specific project. I still come back to the assembly for bid awards. They still would still see the bid award on this and have the option for.
You're just earmarking this chunk of money for this particular piece of.
Correct.
All right, thanks.
Mr. Roberts?
Well, I guess we all know about the parameters of being able to turn down a bid award. So, start backwards here. So on the buying the small, or getting appropriation for the small bulldozer ahead of time, do you not expect to be in front of us in the next year or two?
No.
Okay. So I was just curious about that. We're not going to see you for a while. You're taking a break from us. It seems like that amount of time probably wouldn't be invalidated because you have to bring that amount of time to us anyway at some point in the future. But just curious on that. So on the bulldozer and the compactor, are both of these being added to the fleet now? So if we're looking at your working vehicles, we are now going to have 2 more on the books?
The compactor is an existing piece of equipment that's in the fleet or actively being used within the fleet. So no, that would not be an addition. But the large bulldozer is not actively being used, and it would be an addition to the fleet.
Right.
However, I'd have 2 large bulldozers that I could use over a longer period of time.
So on the usage, would you say that you're in this situation, not the easy maintenance situation on the bulldozer, but being out long-term because of something that takes a longer time to fix it, would that be an average of like 2 weeks a year? Do you have an estimate?
If
Rough.
your question is how, if a piece of equipment is down, how long would that typically be?
No, I'm asking, over the years that you've had just one bulldozer, what have you seen as like a rough average of how many weeks a year you're out because of a large maintenance burden that you've got to get taken care of?
Okay, I have to admit, I haven't tracked that specifically. If it's something like an engine or a transmission that goes out, that can sometimes be 6 weeks at a time. I've seen a piece of equipment out that long.
Okay, so are there not enough vendors in town that we can rent that equipment? I mean, do you really go 6 weeks without a bulldozer?
Yes, that's a good question, and yes, we would, because the equipment, such as the large bulldozer, it's a Caterpillar D8. It's different than a standard D8 bulldozer because of the waste handler package that's on it. It's got additional guarding on it, and we have a tough time, not impossible, but often a tough time finding a D8 to rent and finding someone that will rent us a D8 that we're going to use for processing trash.
Oh, really? They're picky about
They are
renting?
very, very picky. Yeah, very picky.
Wow.
And think about that. You have a whole, a $500,000 machine with the engines exposed on a normal, regular, standard machine. Ours has heavy guards over those engine compartments. Our lights are mounted up high to get it up and away and out of the trash. We have steel rectangular guards on the tracks to strip off anything that gets caught up in the trash. You don't find these on the standard bulldozer.
So have you done any kind of analysis on the cost of the extra maintenance that adding another vehicle to the fleet would take? Even though they'll both last longer, they'll still have annual costs to them.
Well, maintenance intervals come up based upon usage. So obviously the more you use it, the quicker that interval will come up.
So you do everything based on hours?
On hours, yes. And repairs, of course, just occur when they occur is when you have to do the repairs. So I actually think it's a really good idea. Obviously, that's why I'm here. Because instead of just relying on one bulldozer, I'd have two for that flexibility for the repairs and maintenance. But I'd use these two bulldozers over a longer period of time.
Okay, thanks.
Dodge, did you have a question still?
I do. It seems like when you first spoke of this small, I turned my page, the smaller bulldozer replacement, you said you thought it might be out 2 to 3 years. Is that more correct?
I'm going to say it's got 7,600 hours, and let me just see if I can quickly find our average hours. I would say about 1,700 hours per year.
That's not my question. You said 2 to 3 years before you thought you would need it.
But what I'm getting to, it's got 7,600 hours now, 1,700 hours per year. Maybe 2 years would be about 10,000 hours or so. It takes some time, not only for the bid process, bid award process, contract process, but the lead time for actually getting it delivered. It can be a couple months, but it can be up to close to a year as well. It just depends on when that order goes into the factory. I guess I'm just sort of getting ahead on this a little bit, but I don't think I'm getting it too far ahead. Just looking out about the next year, two, maybe 2.5 years. I'm not going to actually start the replacement process until I'm going to be watching and monitoring the existing hours of the existing bulldozer to see where it's at. If we end up using it more, I'm going to accelerate that process. If we use it less, I will reduce that process.
So you could easily add 12 weeks to that or nine weeks to that and do a request also for a replacement. I mean, you could do another ordinance.
Yes, I can do another ordinance, yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Roberts?
I just wanted to ask legal, we're able to amend out lines in this, right, since we'd be going under the amount?
Correct.
Any other questions or discussions on this ordinance? Oh, did you have one, Ms. Dodge?
Yeah, actually, it's a comment. I just want to thank you for being honest, though, about, your plan with that smaller piece of equipment.
Other discussion, comments, questions on this ordinance?
Transparent or whatever.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Jordan, is there any possibility that at some point in the future, well, is there, assuming that this borough stays in the landfill business, is there any possibility that this borough will not need to replace that small bulldozer in the next few years?
No.
Thank you.
Mr. Lajewski.
Actually, I'm just trying to remember. We may have discussed this at budgeting time a little bit. And just roughly, if you could stab in the dark or maybe it's somewhat illuminated, how much of this gets funded basically through property taxes? And I know it's indirect, right? So it's basically what amount of the tipping fees are being funded from waste management companies versus from the transfer sites?
Okay. The Solid Waste Enterprise Fund is primarily funded by tipping fees. That's about 90% of the revenue from that. So that is for every customer that shows up at the gate, the deposit debris pays that tipping fee. Okay? Including would be the collection district, whose funding comes from property taxes.
Right, that's what I'm trying to get down to. Is that like 10% of it or 20% or 90?
Collection district represents about 42-ish% or so, 43, somewhere in there, 45.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or discussions on this ordinance? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you.
See you next week. Our next ordinance is number 2017-20-2G, an ordinance amending the FY 2017-18 budget by appropriating $2,982,000. Wait, is that $2,982.46? No, I'm just used to big numbers, sorry. An ordinance appropriating $2,982.46 in state grant funding to the general fund for the purchase of technology equipment for the Fairbanks North Star Borough Public Libraries. I wish it was $2 million. There's information at page 15. Mayor Castle, can we have a staff report?
We can. We'll go to Renee Van Ort from our library.
So at the end of last fiscal year, our librarians were contacted from the Alaska State Library that there were some online with library funds available, and if we just applied for it and let them know what we wanted to buy, they would approve it and we could spend the money and we'd be reimbursed. So that's what we did. And then we found out that, that was a state library grant. It didn't look at it as our grant, but we were told by finance it still needs to be appropriated. So we spent the funds. We've already received the revenues, the reimbursement from the state. So this is an ordinance to show that we did receive those funds.
Great. Let's see if there's any questions. Any questions or discussion?
Any other secret grants?
No.
Darn it.
Nope.
Thank you for finding some extra money for the library.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
All right.
Our next ordinance is number 2018-20-1L. Ordinance amending the FY 2018-19 budget by appropriating $22,691 from Birch Hill Service Area and $31,596 from Chena Spur Service Area fund balances to the Capital Projects Fund for the required match for FMATS or FAST Improvement Program Surface Upgrades Project. The sponsor is Mayor Castle. There's information at page 20. Mayor Castle.
Thank you. I'm laughing about your fast comment. Anyway, we'll go to Mr. Michael Bradley for that report.
So, through a borough nomination, the Fairbanks Metropolitan Area Transportation System, also known as FMATS, selected Elementary Drive within the Birch Hill service area and Hans Way within the Chena Spur service area for asphalt surface replacement. Elementary Drive is located off of Chena Hot Springs Road and is the main access for Weller Elementary School. The engineer's estimate is $218,000 and requires a match of a little over $22,000, which that match also includes a 15% contingency. Hans Way is located off of Heather Drive, which is at the far southwest end of Chena Ridge and Chena Pump Road. The engineer's estimate is $304,000 and requires a match of over $31,000, which also includes a 15% contingency. The projects will be designed and managed by the Alaska Department of Transportation with an estimated construction time of summer of 2019. That concludes my staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. See if there's any discussion or questions. Anyone? Mr. Roberts.
I'm curious, are these type of matching grants for roads that are in road service areas, are they able to use money that came from state grants in general, without not getting into the details of the grants, or not?
Well, I guess I would say if a service area had grant funds and that grant had the language for capital improvement or even just regular maintenance and can be used for capital improvement, I guess they could use that for a match. But
I was just wondering, we have the big fund of money from the grants, most of which I think, if I remember right, we moved into the loan fund, but there's always money coming back to it. I can't remember if that's moving automatically back or if it stays in as projects get completed. Was wondering if that money could be used as a matching grants for any specific purpose like that.
I think it can. I think we've used it in the past for certain projects. These particular projects, the service areas themselves will be providing that 9% match.
Okay, thanks.
Additional questions or discussion? Ms. Dodge.
How do we make that decision of whether we should use service area money for the match versus grant money for the match? Is that an RSAC?
It's a good question. A couple of times I think that it was used. It was before my time, so I believe that would be like a director and mayor's kind of decision. Anything that I've usually put forward to you guys has been just service area funded.
And the grant, that money then is used for what? Or is it not used?
We currently have that 90-10 matching grant project. Those funds have mostly been expended, and I believe the remaining funds, that money has expired or is about to expire, and there's very little left.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks. Additional questions or discussion on this item? See none. Thank you, Mr. Bradley.
Thank you.
All right. That brings us to 2018-20-1M. This is an ordinance amending the FY 2018-19 budget by appropriating $1,600,000 from the general fund balance to the multi-year general subfund and/or the capital projects fund for the purchase and implementation of a facility asset management system and to employ 4 term permanent full-time equivalent employee positions authorized as necessary for implementation. Sponsors Mayor Castle. There's information at page 26. Mayor Castle.
Thank you. We'll go to our Public Works Director, Mr. Dan Sloan, for this report.
Thank you. This is an ordinance appropriating $1,600,000 from the general fund to purchase and implement an asset management system over the next 2 years. The borough owns over $1 billion worth of assets, including over 100 borough facilities, 47 parks, playgrounds, and ball fields, 10 fire stations, 30 schools, and almost 500 miles of roads. An asset management system will improve how the borough plans, tracks, and budgets for maintenance and capital expenditures on these important community assets. So what is an asset management system? Asset management is a process of managing the life cycle of physical assets to maximize their use, minimize cost, improve quality and efficiency, and safeguard health, safety, and the environment. This will include the following 5 items. First one would be asset lifecycle management, which assists with the planning from conceptual design through construction, occupancy, and the disposal of the asset. The second one is maintenance and planning and scheduling, which includes preventative maintenance and routine work orders. The third one is predictive maintenance, which allows for planning and budgeting for known future major maintenance and capital expenses. And the fourth one is integration with GIS, which is physical asset location and mapping. And the fifth one is integration with finance, which allows for financial tracking of all costs associated with an asset. The reason we need an asset management system is because of the benefit it provides in maintenance and capital planning. We currently use multiple Excel spreadsheets, Access databases, and a couple different computer programs, Micromain, a CMMS work order system at facilities maintenance, and Lucity, which is an asset management system at rural services. Compiling information from all of these resources to create a comprehensive overview of maintenance and capital funding needs is virtually impossible. Additionally, the potential for errors in the data, missing information, and data that not being updated in individual spreadsheets or databases is significant. With that, we'll look at the budget, and you should have a separate handout in your packet that looks like an Excel spreadsheet of the budget. So the overall project cost of approximately $1.6 million. So we'll go line by line through the budget just to get an idea of what all entails in this system. So the first one is the software, which is the asset management software, and that's at approximately $200,000. Second one is the data collection and preventative and predictive maintenance model development at $500,000. And this is based on conducting surveys of all of our facilities and infrastructure and building the associated models. The software annual maintenance obviously is the recurring cost of license renewal and updates. Equipment is the hardware associated with data collection and input into the system. And then there are the 4 personnel required to implement the asset management system. There are 2 positions in the Public Works Department, 1 position each in Computer Services and Financial Services departments. I've provided a separate handout to you guys that you should have that outlines a lot of the typical duties and tasks of each of these positions. So briefly, I'll go over each one. The Public Works Level 4 engineer. This position has overall management of the asset management system, is responsible for software acquisition, data collection and input, implementation and coordination with all the departments involved in the project. This position is expected to continue after the 2-year implementation period to maintain, modify, and update the data to ensure accuracy and usefulness. This is reflected in the fiscal impact statement. However, the funding for anything past 2 years is not included in this appropriating ordinance. The second position is the Public Works Level 9 technician, which is responsible for site visits and data collection, modeling, and implementation of the system. Computer Services Analyst Programmer position performs the programming for it, report generating, and overall integration of the asset management system with existing borough computer systems. And then the Financial Services Level 13 Accountant Technician. This is where we get the integration of financial and capital data with the asset management system and the existing One Solution financial system. So then moving on from the budget, on line 47 of the ordinance shows the anticipated implementation timeline of the asset management system. So the first 6 months is really filling the employee positions, developing the request for proposal for the software package, and completing the Title 16 competitive bidding process. The second 6 months moves into selection of the software vendor, initial software setup, and starting the data collection process. And then starting the second year of the project finishes the data collection and develops some models for data input and integration with the existing borough financial system. That's my notes. The last 6 months includes verifying the data, testing the preventative and predictive maintenance models, final integration with existing systems, testing and report generation, and training the users on how to operate the system. The schedule of assets to be input into the system is expected to be roughly in this order. First would be the borough-maintained buildings and facilities. Second would be rural services data, and that would be a data conversion and import from their existing asset management system. Third would be the parks and playgrounds and ball fields. Fourth would be the fire stations. And fifth and last would be the schools. And once the schools were in, we would have to do the coordination with the school district on how that data is maintained and updated as they occupy and maintain those facilities. So in summary, the borough recently turned 50 years old and has used many different methods for managing assets over the years, all with varied degrees of success. Funding and implementing a comprehensive asset management system now will improve the way the borough tracks, prioritizes, and funds maintenance and capital expenditures on its assets for the next 50 years. And that concludes my staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. Let's see if there's questions. Oh, sorry, Mayor Castle, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, it's kind of, the reason we're in the position we're in is this is a lot of money. We get that. I mean, 1.6 million is more than lunch money. But I'm not aware of any organization our size that doesn't have a facility asset management system. It's the way you manage assets at the magnitude that we have. And I think Mr. Sloan was generous saying we've had varying levels of success over the years. Yeah, we have. And we need to be more professional, do a better job of it, and this kind of equipment is required to do that. We have had comments from the public that we're not maintaining things adequately. That's why we have the problem that we have. And then the same evening, we've had the public say that we're maintaining things too soon. It hasn't failed yet, so why are you working on it or changing it or whatnot? We need better data to get specific, well-documented numbers, easily accessible and available for the public, totally transparent, to itemize maintenance costs, what we've done, and why we're projecting that we need to do what we're going to do. Our current system does not enable us to do that. And consequently, to get where we need to go for an organization our size, it's going to require this amount of money. So we historically had hesitated because of the cost in moving in this direction, but I don't see that we have much of an alternative if we're going to professionally manage everything that we have and have the documentation that we need to back up the decisions that we're making. So thank you.
Mayor, first on the list I had Ms. Dodge.
So you talked about implementation number 1 through 5, and number 1 was borough buildings or something, it seemed like. And number 2 you said was borough services?
Correct.
Could you expound on that?
Yeah, they have an existing asset management system that they use now that tracks culverts, street signs.
Rural services.
Rural services, yes.
Oh, okay. And have you spoken with the school district? Do they use an asset management system right now?
They don't. We've spoken to them, and they're interested in it. And once we get the data compiled and into the system, the next step will be, how do they manage it from there?
Thank you. And if I presume you plan to use this to manage your maintenance and to track it, whether it be the light switch or the
Yes, it does have
generator
a built-in CMMS work order system as well. Yes.
The mayor mentioned that this would help us be transparent in how we manage our maintenance, or perhaps when we request replacements or something. Can you speak more to that? I don't imagine that this is going to be something that the public can go out and search.
No, but we can
run a
we can
report.
definitely pull reports from it that we don't have access to now. And so with the predictive models, we'll know which roofs need to be replaced when. Based on that, we will actually have financial tracking of the money we've spent on particular items, equipment, or buildings, which we don't have today. So definitely a lot more transparent.
So it's more like credibility. And I don't mean that we're uncredible, but it something like you say that you can pull and you can easily show beginning and end.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mayor?
Yeah, for transparency, I mean, when a public member asks us, how much have you spent on maintenance on this generator in the last 10 years, we can't answer that question right now without a huge amount of work and then not having an answer we're necessarily confident in either. With this system, we can push a button essentially and say, last 10 years, we've spent $685,000. Boom. And we'll be glad to provide that information.
Thank you.
I have Mr. Roberts and Mr. Lejeski.
So I guess the first question is why we're not using the funds out of the Asset Replacement Fund, the ARF? seems like that would be the kind of money that's targeted for this kind of software. I don't know if it's spent down or not, but I would assume that'd be the first kind of money we'd use for software.
I think that's a fund that is more designed to handle situations when we don't have the time to come to you and ask for a specific appropriation for something. It's not huge projects like 1.6 million. This is really a project. It includes labor, and the asset replacement fund is for a specific piece of equipment that you're buying, as opposed to a full program where we've got FTEs involved and more project oriented like this is.
Sure, I guess I'd appreciate it if you'd maybe let us know what the balance of that fund is in the ensuing week. So, what's my question on here? So, did we look at all, there are asset management firms out there, some of them even in Fairbanks. Did we look at all at privatizing this function and hiring professionals who do that for a living to do asset management for us?
That's not something we've looked at yet, no.
Okay. And then we've got FTEs, which surprises me, especially the part that the plan at the moment is to keep them working, at least some of them, after we're done, when I would think that each engineer, as they work on a building, or each maintenance person would be entering data and it would go into the system automatically, and you wouldn't need a dedicated full-time person for that. So I'm curious about that, but what I'm really wondering is, are we hiring consultants, not just the company that we're buying this from and a little bit of installation, but are we hiring consultants so that we get this process right? Because if we haven't been doing it before, this kind of data entry project would be easy to mess up, putting the data in incorrectly, not just a wrong number, but in the way you do it and the way you put your model in is critical, I would think, for this type of program. And so do we have a consultant as part of this whole package that is going to help us every step of the way? Because I can't imagine that we have that expertise now because we haven't been doing it.
It's a good question. And yeah, if you go back to the budget, the second line item, or the budget estimate sheet that I handed out, the second line item was data collection and preventative and predictive maintenance model development. And that's part of, will be our anticipation. Obviously, we haven't done the RFP process because we don't have funding yet, but that will be part of our RFP package that we put out. The FTE side on our side is to the verification of all of that data and helping collect all of that data, because it's a lot of data. So.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Lejeski?
Could this database be put online, accessible to the public?
It's a possibility. It depends on the software program we end up. It'll be a competitive process, so we don't know which particular software program we have. And then that'll be a question also between our computer services department on access and security and those type of things. So definitely not a no answer, but we just haven't developed that part yet.
Okay, because I'm just thinking we wouldn't, I mean, you say security, but I'm just thinking it wouldn't be a security risk to our facilities if we knew what was being done.
No, I mean into the computer system.
Okay, you're talking about like hacking that sort of data. That sort of, and so, looking at the whereas here, so and the handout you provide for us, the FTE 2-year plan, those are all anticipated 100% of those going forward for, let's say, another 48 years if this does last for 50?
No, I'm sorry I didn't clarify that enough. It was just the one public works engineer position was the only one that continues after that. The other ones are only there for implementation.
Okay, so the 3 are there to set it up, and then we would need the 4B engineer potentially, unless there's a huge change in technology or whatever, potentially for 48 more years if we did this for 50 years, this particular system.
That's correct.
Okay, so the cost would be 1.6 million plus the recurring cost of that engineer for, yeah, anyway, okay.
Additional questions or discussion on this ordinance? I don't see any, so thank you, Mr. Sloan. That takes us to other committee business and discussion items, and tonight we have before us the major maintenance, energy efficiency improvements and capital improvements draft list updated September 26, 2018. and the 2019 FNSB Legislative and Programmatic Funding Priorities Draft List updated September 26, 2018, prepared by the Capital Projects and Legislative Priority Committees for discussion and recommendations by the committee. Before we give a staff report, I just want to note that the Capital Projects and Legislative Priorities Committee works with the administration to submit both of these lists to the Finance Committee by October 15th. The Capital Projects and Legislative Priorities Committee will be meeting again on October 11th to finalize the list in a resolution sponsored by the committee. That resolution will come before the Finance Committee again on November 1st for questions and discussion, and before the Assembly at the regular Assembly meeting on November 8th. So the Finance Committee can make recommendations to both of these draft lists at tonight's meeting.
Oh, okay.
Before they go back to the committee for its next meeting. And just as I think it's a procedural matter, I think, of course, individual committee members can make comments, but if the committee wants to make a recommendation to the list, we probably need to do that by motion. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
Okay. So that's just the procedural note before we begin. So if the committee is going to make a recommendation regarding either list, we'll need to do it by motion and vote. I have a staff report from Assemblymember Quist, who is the chair of the Capital Projects and Legislative Priorities Committee, and Mayor Castle, so whoever wants to go first.
Well, I don't have a lot to add. You were thorough. We have a couple meetings coming up. We'll have opportunity to provide comments. Today, there's the meeting on the 11th, and then it'll come back before here at Finance Committee before we see it as the Assembly. The timing was deliberate after the election so that we would have a better idea as to what our financial position and our revenue sources would be. And there's as you'll see, there's some items on the list that were also on the bond that was voted down. So the changes that we're probably most likely to make if the election had gone otherwise probably won't be made, just my 2 cents, but it's up for discussion, and we'll be meeting a week from today.
Mr. Quist, Mayor Castle?
Not much to add, I guess. It's, committee decision on all of this, and we've worked through it with the committee. And of note are the two highlighted projects, item 4 and 5. They're on page 33 and 34 of your packets, highlighted in yellow because they were on the bond proposal that was voted down. So they would then, we would want to have them on this list because that's work that still needs to be done, and it's obviously high priority. That's why it was on the bond package.
Thanks, Mayor. So I have Mr. Roberts and then Ms. Dodge. I want to note that the lists begin at page 33 of our packet. So if anybody's looking for the list, they're at page 33, and there's two lists. So let's start with the major maintenance, energy efficiency improvements, and capital improvements list. Mr. Roberts?
So does that include the prioritized and non-prioritized ones? Would you say that category?
Just like 33 through 35.
Yeah, the first list is pages 33 through 37, 38.
So I'd say page 36, I'd like to make a motion that we recommend the deletion of borough office building and land acquisition for $12 million.
Could you repeat that?
Sorry.
Page 36.
I would like to make a motion on page 36 to recommend the deletion of the line borough office building and land acquisition for $12 million.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Roberts and seconded by Mr. Lejeski to delete on page 36 the bullet borough office building and land acquisition $12 million. Mr. Roberts?
So I think we have the temperament of the voters, and with our present situation, I can't imagine us going after a new office building and even looking into that right now. We've got more than enough on our hands, and I don't think this should even be on the list. I mean, how are we going to justify that when we're even talking to our legislators trying to lobby for this when we have all these other things that we know are pretty critical, some of them? So that's my 2 cents.
Any other discussion on the motion? I guess I would note, and Ms. Dolan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, at this point, these are recommendations as opposed to actual deletions from the list. Is that right?
Correct.
Yep, so it'll be that will be our recommendation back to the committee.
That was the form of motion I made, was
Yep.
to recommend the deletion.
Thank you. Just wanted to clarify. Mr. Lawrence.
Just so I make sure I understand the process here, we can recommend what we're doing now and perhaps more so is we're recommending to the Capital Projects Committee what this Finance Committee thinks should be changed.
That's right.
But ultimately, the Assembly in November will make the decision.
That is correct.
Right? All right. Well, I'll speak, while I agree in general with what Mr. Roberts said, I'll speak against it because we do have a need that's not going to go away to expand our office space. And so, I think it might as well just stay on the list. I mean, it's not like it's a need that it doesn't exist. And they've got it, I don't think it's I don't know how the high priority, but I guess they haven't really prioritized. But, yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's giving the public an awareness of something that's going to happen sooner or later.
Additional discussion on the motion to make the recommendation. Mr. Mayor.
Well, I sure would like to see this stay, which is obviously why it's on here. But I don't think there's much of an understanding. Maybe what we need to do is an assembly tour so you can have a better understanding in this facility and the current situation that we're in as far as staff is concerned and this building. And some of the issues that we have, we need to start planning ahead. We are already beyond the capacity of this building. I have professional staff members literally in closets right now, multiple ones. An attorney, I'm sure he loves his new office space. That's not a way to run a professional organization at all. We are splitting up departments and moving people out of this building to try to create space within the building for what we currently have. We have sagging floors. Come on up to the third floor and stand in front of the elevator. I have vertigo, so when the elevator comes up and the floor bounces, I got to back off a little bit because it's a concern for me physically. We need to start planning ahead. This isn't something like even for growth. I'm talking about where we are today with this organization. This building is not fulfilling our needs, and we are going to need to be renting space very shortly. We have a space committee that's trying to figure out who's moving out of this building so that we can take professional staff members out of closets. The ventilation is not designed for the kind of, it's designed for open space. And now that we have all these individual offices built in and people in closets, they're not ventilated properly. And so we have offices where people are running electric heaters and running up the utility bill because they don't get any heat in the wintertime. And we have other folks that are getting cooked out of their office because they're getting ventilation for a space as large as this chambers, and they're in a closet. And this needs to be addressed sooner as opposed to later. Even if this stays on the list and we get the money, you're looking years out before this would actually happen. So we need to plan ahead for these sorts of things, and that's why it's put on this list. And I think it absolutely needs to be considered in the mix of things, because we know this is a problem.
Ms. Dodge and then Mr. Roberts.
So I actually have kind of a meta question that I think is related, and that is, what is our intention with this list? Is this a note to self? Is this a note to ourselves as Assembly members of what we value, and a note to the administration of what we value and want to be working towards? I'm curious.
So, you want an answer from anybody?
Mr. Roberts, or I'm sorry, Mr. Quist, maybe is the chair of the
Well, so
committee. You can-
my understanding is that in November, when the Assembly sees this and finalizes the document, some of which is in order and some of which is not, that we will then share that not only with our lobbyist, but also with our interior delegation. And in this, I think it will be in the form of resolution. And so analogous to other resolutions that we transmit to our representatives in Juneau. And that's my understanding, and I may be incorrect on some of that.
Thank you. I wanted to, that was my understanding too. I just, in looking at the list, wanted to validate that understanding, I'll just say.
Mr. Roberts.
Well, I hope Ms. Dodge is ready to sell this to her colleagues. So, what was I going to say? So, the mayor described some problems in two categories. One is, that our growth has taken us very large, and I guess I would point out that's actually part of the maintenance problem, the same thing where we've grown too much for the assets to pay for the asset maintenance. At the same time, we're doing operations. And what we just got from the public was everyone talks about having a conversation. We all want to have a conversation on this and a conversation about Mary Sign, a conversation about that. Well, we just had a big conversation with the public. They gave a clear message. And so something, as you know, going forward is going to have to change. And that probably means, as the mayor already pointed out in the last few months, there's going to be diminished services. Therefore, there's going to be diminished staff taking care of it. So looking to expand the building, I don't know if it is the appropriate way. But the other part is a lot of maintenance issues that he brought up. We've got these problems, and maybe we need to do some remodeling on this building in a major way for the ventilation, for offices, things like that. But that's a completely different can of worms than this. But I do think this would be very hard to sell to our delegation at this point. Thanks.
Mr. Roberts, Mr. Lawrence.
I don't think what we just got was a very clear message at all. We had 25% of the people vote. Of that 25%, 55% didn't, voted down the bond issue, and 45% voted in for it, and 75% of the people didn't vote at all. I know that when this administration suggested that we close one swimming pool, we had this room full, pretty much all summer it seemed like, saying, no, you can't do that. So no, I don't think the message from this community is at all clear as to what the heck they want. So, I'm going to be looking with interest at future assembly meetings when when the consequences of us not having any money to maintain, or not having enough money to maintain facilities, and this assembly has to start considering closing facilities, how people react. But I just needed to respond to that. I don't think this community knows what it wants.
So I have Ms. Dodge and then Mr. Roberts, and I'll just remind the committee that while debate is allowed on these, that the debate needs to remain germane to the motion before us. So,
Which is to remove the borough office building and land acquisition.
so Ms. Dodge, then Mr.
Thank you.
Roberts.
I guess I would speak to removing this because I think that asking the state at this stage, really, for $12 million to apparently purchase a new office building and land seems incongruent with the reality we seem to be facing at the state level. It's the red face test would seem hard, especially when there are many other items. What is this? This must be $200 million worth of requests here, 150? Anyone added them up?
No.
Well, I see 65 million and a couple of 12s, a 12 and a 17, so that's 100. I just would say that I'd want to be pretty intentional about what I asked. There's something to be said for having a range of asks, but agree that this probably isn't one of them I would leave on.
Mr. Roberts.
So I want to clarify that my statement about being clear is that the voters were clear that they didn't want to pay any more taxes.
Anything else on the motion, which is to remove the last bullet, Borough Office Building and Land Acquisition,
Nicely done.
from the, to recommend that to the committee to remove that item? Any other discussion on this motion? Mr. Lejeski.
I'll speak in favor of it. I'm also interested in hearing thoughts. I think Mr. Quist already spoke on it, but I guess where I'm coming at is with this list in general, I think we have to be strategic. We can't just ask for everything. And I haven't sat in the shoes of the people who are going to evaluate it, but we need to ask for something that can actually happen. And I'm kind of leaning towards the opinion that this is probably something that can't happen, regardless of the possible need. So that's all for me.
Mr. Roberts?
Yeah, I'm just going to say that I'm fine with the list they sent us because, in my opinion, of course, Mr. Quest can give his own opinion on what the committee was sending it to us for. They were sending it to get our discussion to help them fine-tune this list. I can't imagine they're going to send this list to the Assembly in November as it is, with as much stuff as it is. And so they're trying to get maybe a consensus from the Assembly on where it is. And so we're giving them our opinion.
Mr. Roberts, additional discussion on Mr. Roberts' motion. Clerk, it looks like we're ready to vote on the motion.
All right, thank you. Ms. Dodge?
Motion is to remove?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes?
Mr. Lejeski?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
No.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
No. Anyone wish to change their vote? Seeing none?
3-4.
Fails 3-4, although certainly I'm sure Mr. Quist will relate the discussion on this item back to the committee.
Yes, and Mr. Gray as well.
Okay, Mr. Gray is also on the committee. So I think that is an important note that even though we're voting on certain recommendations, I anticipate that the committee will still hear that we had this discussion and took this vote. Any other discussion or motions on the first list, which is the major maintenance, energy efficiency improvements, and capital improvements? Ms. Dodge, and then Mr. Lejeski.
I would move to remove the replacement aquatic center.
Where is that?
It's on page 35, second one down, $35 million.
Second?
So Ms. Dodge has moved and Mr. Roberts has seconded to recommend to the Capital Projects and Legislative Priorities Committee to remove from the list the second bullet, replacement aquatic center, $35 million. Ms. Dodge?
I think that since this appears to be a list that people are going to, that we're going to put together and submit to the legislators, that I don't think the time is right for the replacement aquatic center. I think that the price is not right now for us to be asking for that kind of money from them. And I will state that I am hopeful that the time will come when this community feels like this is a good project and that we're ready to bond it. And I think we will be happy we did that. I just don't think that's right now.
On the motion, I have Mr. Quist.
Thank you. I'd speak against the motion. We do have a need in the community, and this aquatic center would, the idea is that it would replace two pools that are aging, one of which is potentially beyond its useful life. It has to be addressed sometime soon. Clearly, there isn't the appetite for bonding now. I see little harm in leaving it on the list. If nothing, I see that it, raises the awareness of the need that we have in this community. Thank you.
Additional comments on this motion or discussion? So, Mayor Castle.
Well, my question would be, if we take it off, are we going to put on Mary Sy and Hammy individually on the list? Because there's some critical need at both of those facilities. And so if this isn't on the list, we're going to have to do something with Hammy and Mary Sy. I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but individually or together, those two pools would add up to $30 million or so. And we're going to have to do something with them very soon, within the time frame of what everything on this list is, before other things on this list.
Ms. Dodge?
Actually, I had written down a question about why Hammy wasn't on here, so it's part of that answer for me.
Additional discussion on this motion? Seeing none, I think we're ready to vote on the motion to remove replacement aquatic center, $35 million, from the list, and that is at page 35. Clerk?
All right, thank you. Mr. Lawrence.
No.
Ms. Dodge.
Yes.
Mr. Gray.
No.
Mr. Roberts.
Yes.
Mr. Lejeski.
No?
Mr. Quist.
No.
Mr. Cooper.
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
2 to 5.
2-5. So the motion fails. Additional discussion on the first list.
Yep.
Mr. Lejewski, thank you.
I'd like to recommend the removal or the consideration of the removal of the committee of item number 1, emergency operations warm storage facility.
Is there a second? That's on page 33.
Second.
All right, Mr. Lejewski has moved and Mr. Quist has seconded for the removal of item 1, emergency operations warm storage facility. Again, this is a recommendation for removal of emergency operations warm storage facility for $4,500,000 on page 33. Mr. Lejewski, do you want to speak to that?
Okay, so I understand this is a, cost and a benefit, and I understand one half of it very well, I think, and not the other half. So I hope Mr. Quist will respond to the other half. And it's the benefit part that I don't know that I specifically understand the critical need of this, and I'm sure he'll speak to this. But the cost part, this is what I see. We're a couple $100 million or more behind in maintenance. This is going to put another $4.5 million facility on the map. And we don't have enough money to maintain what we got. So this is just going to further increase the imbalances that we have if this, works its way through the process and the state gives us such a facility. So that's the anyway, that's the part I understand well, and that's all for me.
Thanks, Mr. Quist.
Thank you. I'd speak against this motion. So my understanding is, and we could get a report from the administration in better detail, but my understanding is that due to lack of warm storage, it does have a negative impact on our ability to deliver emergency services, as well as results in increased maintenance costs, and wear on emergency service apparatus. And I think so. The administration has made it clear in the past that this was a priority. I think one of the reasons that it is also good to leave on the list is that it does have a significant public safety focus, and I think that's something that it will be attractive to legislators to spend limited funding on. And all that being said, does it belong number 1 on the list? Maybe, but I maybe not. But I do think that it does belong on the list. Thank you.
Next, I have Mr. Lawrence next.
Question for the administration. Do we have a ballpark estimate on the value of all the emergency equipment that this borough owns?
We could get that. I don't have that off the top of my head. It's many millions of dollars. And we do end up with premature aging of that equipment by keeping it in cold storage. One of my concerns is the fact that when the equipment is in cold storage and you need it in an emergency, generally you want it in a hurry. And if it's frozen, because it's 40 below zero, which is when we tend to have more emergencies when it's cold, a lot of it doesn't work till it's warmed up. So we have that issue. I mean, there's a public safety issue involved with some of it. And we can provide more details if you'd like on it, too. This is back to just an overall space issue that we have at our facilities. We've outgrown storage, and we're storing things in office areas now, and partly why this building's overloaded, too, and the floors are sagging. Because we're using office areas as storage areas, and we have people in storage areas too. So we had to move things out, and so this helps correct the overall issue that we have a serious lack for space right now across our organization.
Lawrence, you had a follow-up?
Follow-up. Mayor, could you give us examples of what this emergency equipment is? I mean, we've got fire houses around with fire trucks, and those are kept warm, hopefully, most of the time. But what kind of equipment are we talking about?
Just about everything. I mean, imagine if we in a flood in the summertime and people come to town and we're doing emergency housing, at the Carlson Center and everything that you have to haul in to make that an evacuation facility, cots and you name it. Generators, electronic equipment, all kinds of hazmat issues that can come up and the equipment needed to deal with any kind of fuel spills or any hazmat type issues that would happen. So some of it's electronic, technical equipment, protection devices, and anything that you could imagine for emergency response needs.
So this is, you're thinking in terms of one facility that could also be utilized to house people who are displaced?
No, this is strictly for equipment. To try to get our equipment in one place, which would be advantageous also, instead of using storage containers distributed around the borough and trying to remember what is stored where, because we don't have a facility for storage. It's just strictly a warehouse storage facility that would be kept at a moderate temperature to keep equipment warm and dry, so it's ready for emergency response.
All right, thank you.
Additional questions or discussion on the motion, which is to recommend removal of the emergency operations warm storage facility from the list? I don't see any additional discussion, so clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
Thank you. Ms. Dodge?
No.
Mr. Ledesky?
Yes?
Mr. Lawrence?
No.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
2-5.
Fails 2-5. I didn't have anybody else on my list to talk about the list in general. So any other discussion on the first list, the major maintenance and capital improvements list? Mr. Ledesky?
So I'd say in general, most of these items are replacing, upgrading something that we already have. So according to those original comments, they're not adding to our problem of producing more building than we can already afford. So in that respect, it's generally a fairly good list. And I'll also just note, I just looked up Arctic North Slope crude. It looks like it closed at 85.36, I think yesterday. Anyway, it's going up, so if it keeps going up by the time of the session, maybe that makes the prospects of success with the list better.
Thanks, Mr. Ledesky. I'll note for the record that Ms. Major has joined us.
So noted.
Additional comments, Mr. Lawrence?
Regarding the Carlson Center, my recollection is that this is a question that the replacement of the ice rink, equipment was something like a $7 million cost, and this is 11.75. So I mean, we're talking about the roof over the rink and some other items. So is this well, I guess I don't know if the administration wants to expand this, but expound upon this, but this seems to be an increase from 7 million to 11,750,000. So I guess I'd like a little more detail about, the extra, 4.7 million.
So there is a variety of projects in this at the Carlson Center. What we put in the bond package was the ice plant, which is $7 million. The ice plant is critical, and that's the major piece of this overall project. The ice plant's beyond its manufacturer's recommended lifespan, and it's showing its age more than I'm showing my age. And so it needs to be addressed. We don't want to see catastrophic failure on it in the middle of a season, and it's why we have broken things out a little bit on it. You can probably hear more about that with the new administration, and I'm not sure where they're going to go, but some of this is less critical. I mean, clearly there's major maintenance issues with carpeting in the building that's torn and duct taped together, and et cetera. So there's a number of other maintenance needs at that facility, including the main roof that needs a little more insulation and replacing. So this large figure at 11,750,000 is the critical component for the ice plant and all the other maintenance, not all the maintenance needs, the more critical maintenance needs within the building too that we think need to be addressed in the short term and shouldn't be put off too much longer. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Additional discussion on this list, major maintenance and capital improvements. I'm not seeing any. I guess I'll make one comment for the committee members who are present to consider as part of the next committee meeting discussion with regard to the aquatic center, also talking about Hammy and Mary Sy as just part of that conversation. Mr. Quist?
Thank you.
And you may have already.
Thank you. Even though we didn't take any positive action that's going to result in a specific recommendation being sent to the committee, I request that the clerks transmit this section of our minutes, or specifically so that the committee can still consider this conversation in our next meeting, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, so we have nothing on the first list. We're going to move to the second list, which is the 2019 Fairbanks North Star Borough Legislative and Programmatic Funding Priorities, and that begins on page 39 and ends on page 42. Some of the items on there are already shown in strike-through. I don't know if there's any additional staff report that Mr. Quist or the administration would like to give on this list.
Do
But
the schools afterwards.
schools were part of the list.
I have nothing further.
Okay, so any comments from the administration on the legislative and programmatic funding priorities, Mayor Castle?
Probably not right now. You just got an update from Ms. Dolan regarding some of the air quality stuff. We're still noodling through, that's a technical legal term, noodling through some of our position as a result of the air quality initiative that passed and changed the way we will be addressing what we're doing for air quality going forward. We still have some questions. There's some givens that are obvious for what we're not going to be doing. There's a couple gray areas that we're trying to figure out exactly where the line is in some of the things like the stove change-out program. With can we do half of it? Can we do all of it? Can we do 2/3 of it? And we want to make sure that we are meeting absolutely the intent of the voters' initiative. We heard the message loud and clear, but we've also heard that whereas is in the initiative too, speaking to we need to work on air quality also where we can. We're just not going to regulate or fine, and you're familiar with it. So we have to figure out exactly what that means to us as an organization. You know, how many staff are we going to trim? We're going to be trimming some. Which ones? And all of that is pending exactly what we're going to do for an air quality program going forward. So we're still working through that. We still could use some help financially, so these things are probably still applicable, but we'll have some more definitive information for you in the very near future too. We'll shoot you a memo with, and also we need to do an ordinance adjusting things. So we're trying to figure out what's going in the ordinance, you know, the specifics of it at this point. It's a high priority for us. We've already had more than one meeting and invested many hours into this, but it's complicated with the complexity of some of the programs. So I guess these numbers are good for now to leave in here. By the time the next committee meeting rolls around, we'll have some more definitive answers for you on that topic.
So I'll just note for those who might be listening online or listening to the recording later, the first three items under programmatic funding have to do with air quality requests to the legislature. So other discussion from the committee, Mr. Roberts?
First, I have a question, and that is on page 40, the PACE and on-bill financing. What's hasn't been done that the borough would still want done? I thought the commercial was passed the year before, and the residential on-bill was passed this last year, so what's still missing?
What's missing is how are we going to administer the program? So the current legislation that passed allows municipalities to have this program. We have looked at this across the country, and the successful programs across the country have one agency that administers the program essentially for all the municipalities in their state. Those are the successful programs. The ones that aren't so successful and are failing are where each municipality tries to create the system and the administration to handle this program. It's very complicated stuff, to say the least. In Alaska, probably Anchorage is the only community that has the resources to run a PACE program. We've looked at it, and we don't have the resources to put it together. It would cost way, way too much money. The state realizes it, and they're looking at options, because if they created one agency to handle it for all municipalities, it wouldn't cost very much individually for municipalities to utilize the program. There could be a charge, or potentially engage a nonprofit organization. Some states have a nonprofit that's been created to administer the whole program. So it's a very valuable program, but it's beyond our financial resources, and I'm not advocating for it locally, but I would love the state to figure out, and they are working on it, to figure out, can we create one statewide agency to administer this and create all the forms, the legal paperwork, yada, yada, yada.
So with the on-bill financing, and it even mentions in the first sentence there, that's about a utility. So wouldn't the utility deal with that just through their billing system, which they already have to have a billing system, they have to deal with it? I can see the pace being a little more complicated. We're dealing with property taxes, but it seems like on-bill financing from a utility could be handled by them, and that way they would also have the cost being paid by the person who's getting the loan. It would just be added into their cost and work itself out.
Well, the person who's getting the loan is going to pay the bill. It's who do they pay it to? And PACE and on-bill financing are similar but different.
Right.
And on-bill financing has a number of different ways that it can be administered and applied. Where does the money come from for the loan? The utility can loan money. The legislation that's passed has pretty well just left it wide open and said, get creative, do this any way you want. It's a legitimate program to have, but it's pretty open-ended as far as how you would apply it, both PACE and on-bill financing.
Sure. So I guess I won't make a motion. I'd just like to make a comment for the committee members that you might separate the two. I do understand there's a similarity there, but you'll see most of the language is talking about the CPACE, the commercial PACE program passed a few years ago, and what the mayor says makes perfect sense with regards to municipalities in the state and how much it costs to run a program like that. But I think an on-bill financing run by a utility, that's just like a utility having a program like the budget plan, Golden Valley or sourdough fuel or something like that, that I think wouldn't be all that complicated. They'd have to, they have to interface with bankers, of course. There's a little bit more complexity there than I'm saying, but I'd just like the committee to maybe think about that more. Might make more sense. So I do want to make a motion, though. On the very first item on page 39, the Enhanced Home Heating Appliance Exchange Program, $2 million, which looks like we're trying to get more state funding for home heating, which I think would be great, but I think we should put language in here for the ESPs. I don't know if I need a motion for that. I just want to, I'll throw it out there to committee. Maybe think about getting the state to look at ESPs, which is what I think they're absolutely going to have to do if they ever want to solve this problem. And so if we had a source of funding that would help us fund ESPs, then, that would be a big step forward. And it would be great if we could get the state to chip in on that.
Are you making a motion to make that recommendation, or just a comment?
Sure. I'll make a motion to make that recommendation.
By Mr. Robertson, seconded by Ms. Dodge to
I was afraid of opening up the conversation too much, but
make a recommendation to add consideration of ESPs in the first item under programmatic funding, Enhanced Home Heating Appliance Exchange Program. Discussion on the motion? Mr. Lejeski?
Yeah, I was wondering about ESPs too, so I'm glad you brought it up. And now that it looks like the borough's hands are going to be slightly tied in what it can do, this might be one of the most effective things to do for air qualities if we could buy ESPs and install them for people with state money. And if Jeannie Olson happens to be listening, or will listen to this, if you happen to have data on how they work on wet wood versus dry wood, I'd love to see that. And I don't know if anyone else in the Assembly would have that, but that'd be very interesting.
Thanks, Mr. Lejeski. Mr. Lawrence.
Well, actually, I agree with the proposed amendment, but I'm not sure procedurally how to make this happen. But I think ESPs can make a difference in the amount of particulate matter that's in the air. I think could make a big difference. What I don't think makes a big difference is this enhanced, this wood stove exchange program. I've been at it. We've been looking at this for 5 years, or at least 6 years since I've been on the Assembly. We recently had some tests done between two, very high quality wood stoves that meet this program's requirements, and the difference between the output of PM 2.5 when dry wood was used and when wet wood was used was night and day. Bottom line is these wood stoves that are supposed to make a big difference in reducing PM 2.5 emissions don't make any difference at all if they're not used right. And a quick question: how many wood stoves do we estimate having in this borough, Mayor? Do you know?
I don't remember number of wood stoves total. Yeah, it's in the teens of thousands, and I don't remember exactly now. And the number that we have is just a WAG number because there's no registration on stoves or anything like that, so we don't have any hard data. We're just guesstimating from surveys we've done.
Well, I know we've spent millions and millions of dollars trying to upgrade the wood stoves in this community, and in my opinion, and I think Air Quality Division would agree, the improvement to air quality for that investment is marginal at best. And that if we're going to use money from the state, ESPs, I definitely agree with that. I think there's a good chance that can make a significant difference. But what we ought to be doing, in my opinion, is using money to make up the difference between the cost of heating with wood and the cost of heating with fuel oil, and pay people the difference so that people don't use wood stoves when the air is bad. But I think we're just frankly spending money in a very inefficient way to address this problem by this wood stove exchange program, and therefore I move to amend the amendment to delete the reference to the enhanced home heating appliance exchange program and leave ESPs in.
So, Mr. Lawrence, I think that should be a separate motion
All right,
after this one.
we can come back to it. Then I will withdraw my motion to amend the amendment.
Thank you. Mayor Castle had his hand up with regard to your point, Mr. Lawrence, and then I have Ms. Dodge on the list.
Well, ESPs are something that we've pushed hard for, both with the state and EPA, contrary to their opinions. The good news was we felt they had a very good application in our no-ash program because they clearly would help us there. And unfortunately, the no-ash program just went away. That's a regulatory program, and we can't do that anymore. And so right now, we don't have a good application for ESPs within our program. We can, this question I'm sure will come before you in the not-too-distant future. It'll be a different person in this chair. But we have to think about how we're going to spend our money with spending $500,000 on ESPs that we can't put into a program. We could move the data to EPA and ask them, but we already know what their opinion is, and I'm not so sure we're going to get too far with that. So we will be collecting some more data and asking some more questions about that, but the removal of the borough from this program is causing problems for us that we don't have a say in the game, and we know that they're not enamored with ESPs nor interested in investing any time, money, or energy in it for any of the programs that they run. So now we've got a little bit more of a challenge in front of us.
Dodge on the motion to...
I was just going to answer Mr. Lajewski's question about Greenwood and ESPs. When we had the manufacturer on the line, I asked him about that, and he said, why would anyone burn Greenwood? So that's the level of testing that they've done so far on ESPs in Greenwood.
All right, additional discussion on the motion, which is to make a recommendation to the Capital Projects Committee and that they consider ESPs under item 1 on the programmatic funding list, enhanced home heating appliance. Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, I just want to point out that, and actually I was going to mention later, the letter to the editor I just submitted, but I'm certainly going to be lobbying my state legislators and governor candidates to have the state really look at ESPs and to do something about that, to move in an ESP direction, a technology direction. And so I think this would be right in line with that.
Thanks. Additional discussion on the motion. Mr. Lawrence?
Yeah, but what I just heard from the mayor is if we ask for money to be allocated for ESPs, how do we administer it? I don't know that we can designate a certain segment of the population to get the benefit of that money now that we, now that the NOASH classification, I think, has become irrelevant. So, I mean, I like ESPs, but I mean, I think this is one of the many unintended consequences that this home heating initiative will have is if we do get money from ESPs, what do we do with it? And how do we decide who gets it?
Mr. Roberts and Ms. Dodge.
So that, I think, is actually easy to answer. The Prop 4 did not do away with the wood stove change-out program, except for any coercive elements in it. So we're still able to do wood stove change-outs. ESPs can be integrated in it. Even if we can't use the EPA money, we could use state money. We could have parameters and prioritization as long as there was no coercive elements involved, anything being demanding or restrictive on how someone heats their home. So it certainly would be possible, just like when the propositions were passed in time past, we had a wood stove change-out program. We were able to do that then. We just had to eliminate certain components. Thanks.
I have Ms. Dodge, and then Mr. Lajewski, and then Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Roberts kind of made my point, but that's what I was going to say. Just the area that we know to be in non-attainment that's most serious. There's ways to map it out, the triangle of death. If they're in that area and they want an ESP, then you could make it a criteria. The criteria, or you can, think about what the criteria might be.
Mr. Lajewski?
Yeah, so I guess similar to those two comments, unless the attorney's saying we'd be exceeding our authority, I mean, I would think we could, prioritize by geography. We could put out an application with a survey that says what percentage of your wood or your heat do you get from wood and alternative heat sources, and you would try to put it to the people who burn the most, who live in the dirtiest areas. And when you run out of money, you run out of money. But that's kind of what I would envision anyway.
Back to Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, no, I acknowledge that this borough is not prevented from using carrot. It just can't use a stick anymore. But Ms. Dolan, I guess my question to you, because I haven't had a chance to read, your memo, but do we have any problems of taking state money and directing it to some residents and not to others?
I think that's probably a bigger discussion than this, because that relates really to the initiative ordinance and not to this program. But the initiative language has broad restrictions on our ability to regulate operation or installation of wood burning appliances. some of our grants and funding sources, not the state grants, but some of the federal grants, require us to have a deed restriction in those when someone applies and is given money for a change out or a removal. So there's questions about our ability to continue some of those programs.
And I note that we may have a more robust discussion on the effect of the initiative number 4 at some point in the near future. And we're talking about recommendations to the Capital Projects Committee for consideration. So Mayor Castle.
Specific to ESPs and using state or federal money for that. So when they give us this money and we are writing a grant request, right, actually we are rewriting the grant request pending legal decisions on this, but all of this money comes with strings. And it would be great to buy an ESP for everybody, but I can guarantee EPA is not going to give us $4 million. We're asking for $4 million, by the way, from EPA, or 5. They're not going to give us that for ESPs because they think they're not as effective as what some folks in our community are saying. And so while we might be able to hand out money or ESPs to the community if we had the money, they're not going to give us the money to do that. That's kind of the problem here. And so we're trying to figure out what can we legally do that they would fund, that they're willing to fund. And that's a challenge with this. We're not giving up. We still want to do stove change-outs, but not so much a stove change-out because, as Mr. Lawrence was identifying, some of the benefits of going from a wood stove to a wood stove are minimal compared to going from a wood stove to a gas device or something like that. So we're trying to make headway with all of those programs, but when EPA looks at those, they attach different strings to the program, and those strings are typically regulatory type strings, and we can't do that. And so you'll be hearing more about this as we fine-tune it and try to get where we want to go, because we want to try to maintain as much of the program as we can. That's our intention, without any of us going to jail.
Additional discussion on the motion. I think to recap, the motion would be to make a recommendation to the Capital Projects and Legislative Priorities Committee that under Enhanced Home Heating Appliance Exchange Program on page 39, they consider adding ESPs to the, or making a recommendation regarding ESPs to the change-out program. Is that right? Okay. Clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Lejeski.
Yes.
Mr. Roberts.
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence.
Yes.
Mr. Gray.
Yes.
Ms. Major.
Yes.
Ms. Dodge.
Yes.
Mr. Quist.
Yes.
Mr. Cooper.
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
8-0.
its recommendation is adopted 8-0. Mr. Lawrence, did you want to make another motion?
Yeah, I would move on the first item listed under the programmatic funding that we delete any reference to the Enhanced Home Heating Appliance Exchange Program.
Second.
All right.
Mr. Lawrence has moved and Mr. Quist has seconded a recommendation to the Capital Projects Legislative Priorities Committee to remove any reference to Enhanced Home Heating Appliance Exchange Program.
The reason I'm saying this is because we have finite funds to deal with this problem, to deal with all our problems, and we're not getting much bang for the buck. You know, each change out, I'm trying to remember now, I haven't looked at it, but these change outs are costing us several $1,000s per stove to replace one, you know, dirty stove with supposedly a less dirty stove. And because of all the other parameter or other factors involved, including operation and the nature, you know, what kind of wood is being put into that stove, we're not getting much return for the amount of money we've spent. We've spent on wood stove change out, you know, I don't know, and I don't expect the mayor can just cite it off, but I suspect we've spent between $5 and $10 million, and closer to 5 than 10, I suspect, but I don't think we've gotten much for that. And it just makes people feel good about continuing to burn wood, that, oh, I have a clean stove. But it's clear that, you know, that doesn't cut it. It's how we burn, and frankly, if you use dry wood and you operate it properly, even an inefficient stove is probably going to be pretty good. So, or at least it will be. I just don't see enough of an improvement or a reduction in PM 2.5 to justify this program. I think we should have gotten away from it 3 years ago.
Mr. Roberts? Then Mr.
So,
Gray.
I disagree. I'd like everyone to remember the graph we were shown of the progress in North Pole and the continuous dramatic decline for the 3 years that were before either course of rules or the enforcement of them. And so, but yet we got a lot, and that was through the wood stove changeout program and education. Just those two factors, we had a dramatic decrease in the 3 years for North Pole, which I think is, and it was about the same amount every year. So I think that's also enough to show that it's not just a weather thing, a one-year weather blip or something. So I do think that there was a lot of positive, and it's not just that it's a newer, better stove, though certainly I think technology is part of the answer, and that was part of it. But it's a different attitude. When those people come in, they get their new stove, especially once it got changed to making sure they had education and wood sheds and all that. As has been testified, there's a lot more wood sheds up than used to be. So that's the education component. But I think that the wood stove changeout really did a lot of help. I'll just leave it there.
I have Mr. Gray next, then Mr. Lawrence.
Sure. I guess I agree with Mr. Roberts in that I think we have seen some effectiveness with this program. It's not that it's I don't know. I guess I don't feel that it's been minimal, but I think that beyond that, probably the future assembly, I guess, needs to look at more ways to incentivize homeowners to move towards cleaner devices, or perhaps, if possible, incentivize them to move away from wood burning if possible. So that would just be my 2 cents. Thanks.
Makes sense. Mayor, did you want to address that point before I move to Mr. Lawrence, or?
Well, yeah, because I agree with Mr. Lawrence and Mr. Roberts and Mr. Gray. I'm concerned that the language here, this is a carryover from a prior year, and it's worded what I would have to say incorrectly, and I would change the wording more than eliminate it. This is worded like it is strictly an stove exchange program. Our program has evolved. That program is now not just wood to wood. It's made great strides, as Mr. Roberts has pointed out, but a lot of that has come from wood stove to something other than wood stove. That's where our biggest gains are, and we definitely want to keep doing that. Now, we are gaining effectiveness with that program because EPA has loosened the rules for us, and they're continuing to do so. We've had discussions, and our expectation is our next grant will provide us more flexibility with how we can spend the money that they're giving us. So they're going to loosen the strings on it some. I don't have definitive answers for you yet exactly what we're going to be able to do with that money until we get some legal determinations that I've referenced earlier here. So I think it's premature to take this out. I think what would be appropriate, though, is to expand the language so that it's not just exchange an existing heating appliance for a more fuel-efficient or cleaner burning device. What we want to do is be able to exchange that for a generator, no device, gas devices, so that we can swap out at any different level. That's what we want to advocate for, because those are the cleanest things. When someone takes a wood stove out and puts a generator in so they don't need backup heat, we score big time on air quality improvement, and actually the homeowner scores, because now the refrigerator works as well as their heating boiler when their generator kicks on. So you can have a beer while you're warm in your house instead of just being warm. And so really that's what we want to advocate for here. It's a very viable, effective program, the way we're trying to lean it here. We still have to get a little more latitude out of EPA, but I think we're there. We're there if we didn't have the initiative. The initiative's what is raising the question right now. Can we get the language loose enough from them that we have absolutely no regulatory component to this program anymore? Then we're in good shape, and we're still working that.
Mr. Lawrence, then Mr. Lejeski, then Mr. Gray.
Well, first of all, we don't know why the air quality problem in North Pole has improved over the last 3 years. All we can do is guess. But I would suggest that anecdotally, my experience is that we have a lot more wind these last winters than we have, in the previous, 35 years that I've lived here. I think we've been lucky on that. I know that when Mr. Cooper and I introduced that, the hydronic heater ordinance, which unfortunately didn't go anywhere, a lot of people, I can't remember the number, but significant, at least 10 to 20 hydronic heaters were exchanged out, and a lot of them from the North Pole area, and those things generate a lot of PM 2.5. And as the mayor just said, the improvement, this exchange program, probably what makes a much bigger impact or improvement in their air quality is not exchanging a wood stove for another wood stove, but exchanging a wood stove for something different. And I just repeat my argument that, we don't have much money to deal with this problem, and we need to get the biggest bang for our buck. And exchanging one wood stove for another wood stove, I don't think gets us there.
I have next Mr. Lejeski, then Mr. Gray. Dodge.
So, like the mayor, I mostly agree with everybody. I definitely agree, Mr. Lawrence, that if you exchange one wood stove for a slightly cleaner another one, it may not make that big of a difference. And I definitely agree with Mr. Roberts. In this case, I agree more with Mr. Roberts that probably I guess I'd say I agree. We don't know for sure what the cause of the decline of the particulate readings was, but it's possible you're both right. It's possible it's done due to voluntary burning, cleaning wood, education, and wood changeout, and weather patterns. Who knows? Maybe global warming's in there too. I don't know. But at any rate, where I'm coming down here is that I'd like to have the flexibility to do stoves. So generally, I guess this is a personal bias of myself. I don't like bureaucrats, but this is a perfect example where we should have a bureaucrat who can, come up and evaluate, is it worth it from this stove to this stove, or what's the criteria? And I'd like to provide that flexibility, although I'd prefer most of it gets spent probably on ESPs. But anyway, I just wanted to keep that flexibility, so I'll be voting against I forget what we're on. We're not an amendment to an amendment. It's just an amendment, right?
Just a motion to make a recommendation.
Oh, just a motion, okay.
All right, next I have Mr. Gray.
Sure. So I'm all for ESPs and adding that in, as we did in our previous motion, or recommendation motion, rather. However, I don't think that, they're going to save us entirely. And I agree with the mayor and Mr. Lejeski that I would like to have the flexibility kept in this language so that we can pursue and advocate for those things that will make an impact. And just like the mayor and Mr. Lawrence said, that is moving away, if possible, from a wood burning device and towards other technologies. But I would like to see this kept to give us that flexibility to try to work around this program.
Dodge.
I'm just looking at the language, as the mayor pointed out, it's a voluntary enhanced home heating appliance exchange program. And I believe that home heating appliance has this pretty specific definition in our code, as I recall, but certainly the last line is existing heating application or appliances for more fuel efficient and cleaner burning devices. And I think you certainly speak in support of that, I presume, Mr. Lawrence.
Yes, I do.
If that's the end goal that we would be encouraging.
My motion is to delete references to, true. Yeah, I guess I'm against us buying wood stoves for people, just wood stoves, any wood burning devices. I'm not against enhanced home heating appliances in general.
Additional discussion on the motion, which is to remove reference to enhanced home heating appliance exchange program. That was
Well,
the
it
motion.
probably, yeah. You know, Ms. Dodge makes a good point. It's not specifically stated. I guess my real motion, and we've talked about it long enough, I don't think we have to start over, is that this enhanced home heating appliances should not include wood stoves. Or at least they can be replaced, but they should not be what is replacing, the borough should not be buying wood stoves for people. That's my recommendation to the committee. And that's what this motion is all about.
Right. Additional discussion on the motion. Mr. Lejewski.
Sorry, this is somewhat not that serious, but it sounds like you're in favor of free markets, having the borough not buy stuff for people, so I like that.
Additional discussion on the motion. Mr. Roberts.
Well, one of the biggest mistakes I think we made on this issue in the past is when the Assembly decided to put bans on pellet stoves instead of incentivizing them. And we could have back then started really pushing for pellet stoves, and that it just took away a lot of the incentive when we did that. It didn't give people a reason. And so I think we should leave it up to the administration to figure out, because it might be a barrel stove and we're giving them a nice 2.0 stove. It's like, maybe that's worth it, you know? So I'd vote no on the amendment, but I mean, we're getting into these administrative details that aren't going to go anywhere with the intended purpose of this list anyway.
Additional discussion on this motion. Let's add that regardless, I think that this has been a good discussion that the members can take back to the committee, and people have made good points that maybe the language should be changed somewhat. On the motion, clerk, let's vote.
All right, thank you. Ms. Dodge?
No.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
No.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Lejewski?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
1-7.
fails 1-7. Other discussion or comments, let's maybe keep it on programmatic funding for now, and then we can move on to legislative priorities. Anything else on programmatic funding? Mr. Lejewski?
Do we think we can get more than 2 million for the one we were just talking about? Just because now that the Prop 4 passed, maybe there's more need for it. Question.
All right. Additional discussion on this point?
Yeah, we can certainly get more. This is just sort of a request document, but we're planning on our current grant request we're working on is $4 to $5 million.
Additional discussion on programmatic funding items on the legislative and programmatic funding priorities list. All right, let's move and see if there is anything on legislative priorities, which is the next page 40 through 42. Anything anybody would like to discuss, make comments on that list? And I assume that, just real quick comment, that, and maybe someone from the committee can answer this, those that are struck through are things that the committee recommended taking off the list, and so I suppose people could ask about those as well. Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. This amending the Public Records Act, which is not a huge deal, but it makes sense to me. Why has that been deleted?
Mr. Quist.
Well, so the administration initially made the recommendation, and either the administration or maybe legal would like to speak to it further, but it's as much sense as it does make, and I think it does make, to be able to shift the burden of public records requests, especially ones that are being done by maybe businesses outside of the state that then result in a lot of expense for the borough, in particular the legal department. And so as great as it would be to mitigate that cost, there doesn't seem to be a lot of political will behind it, and it's also like the optics of it are very poor, is one of the reasons that legislators have been reluctant to touch it in the past, even though it it doesn't actually, and I think the idea is that you would want to craft it in a way that it especially didn't limit the access of residents to public records, as I'm kind of going on, but it seems like a very anti-transparent piece of legislation, and so the political cost is high, but the actual benefit is relatively low. And that's my understanding, and that's why it's been recommended for removal.
Nolan, anything you want to add?
The only thing I'd add to what Mr. Quist said is that we have made a couple runs at this and we haven't been able to get a sponsor, and we've done a lot of follow-up work, a lot of legwork on what other states have done and questions that have arisen, and we just haven't been able to get anyone to sponsor it. So I don't know that it's worth putting the effort in.
Mr. Lawrence, any other comments on Public Records Act before?
Well,
Mr. Lejeski?
ditto on this state statute on retainage interest, where we're paying through the nose, although interest rates are going up a little, so it's not as bad as it has been. But is that the same reason? We keep asking and nobody's going for it?
So that was a little bit of the concern there. And then we also started looking at what other people are doing that don't use retainage. And so there may be other options, like including liquidated damages clauses. And so Public Works is working on alternatives to that issue, but they couldn't get support on that either.
Thank you.
Mr. Lejeski.
I'd move to remove sales or income tax should the FNSB Assembly take a formal position. Or move to recommend the removal of. I think that's the correct language.
So it's been moved by Mr. Lejeski and seconded by Ms. Dodge to recommend removal of consideration of taking a position on sales or income tax. That's on page 41. Mr. Lejeski, do you want to speak to it?
Well, I'll be completely honest with you guys. I'm really confident that if this gets considered by this next assembly, at least one of those will be a yes, and I don't want that to happen. So I just don't want to even consider it.
So, and I think this is for not consideration by the assembly, but by the legislature, and the assembly taking a position on whether the state should enact a sales or income tax. Yeah.
Yes, so I'm confident that the assembly would recommend that we end up having one of the two.
Gotcha.
Possibly both. I don't know exactly, I'm not going to make that far predictions. Anyway, that's where I'm coming from.
Discussion. Mr. Quist?
Yeah, I'd speak against this recommendation. I think that it's clear that a broad-based tax of some sort is going to happen at the state level. I mean, to me, it seems like it's a necessary part of the solution. Whatever that ends up looking like will have a significant effect on this community, and I see no reason why we shouldn't have a formal input into that. Thank you.
Mr. Roberts?
Well, I disagree. I think that it was made quite clear in this last session that the tax was definitely going to be fought against. I mean, I think the PFD heist was a tax, but going to this kind of taxation was clearly shown that that wasn't going to happen. Of course, everything can change next month, but based on history, I'd say that it's probably not going to happen, and they're going to have to find a different way to solve their problem. And we'll have quite a new contingent, no matter what, deciding that. So we'll see. Thanks. So I'm going to vote yes for this recommendation to delete this item.
There's just a little discussion on the recommendation motion to delete this item. Mr. Lawrence.
So what the impact of this item is that either the legislative, capital budget and legislative affairs committee will make a recommendation, and the next assembly will decide whether to take a position on this or not. All right. Yeah, then I speak in favor of keeping this in there. I don't know whether the next assembly will want to take a position on this or not, but it's an important issue. The state cannot, continue to operate as it is now if we don't some additional revenue. And I don't know why this borough shouldn't express an opinion on it, or, you know, the administration and the assembly. So, you know, I will vote against this amendment.
Additional discussion on this motion. Mr. Mayor.
I'll just throw out that the Alaska Municipal League and the Alaska Conference of Mayors is discussing this exact thing also. There's a lot of different positions that you can take. One position option is we don't recommend a broad-based tax, but if you're going to do one, we would prefer it be the sales tax, or we would prefer it be an income tax over a sales tax. There's quite a bit of variability in the different communities around the state as what works in their community or would work and what could be catastrophic. And so I don't think it hurts to have a position if the Assembly is so inclined to have a preference one over the other. I mean, if you have no preference, fine, but you can state, excuse me, the preference is no tax first. That's preference one, and then preference two is if you're going to do one, do the one you prefer.
Mr. Lejewski.
I'm on the Permanent Fund Corporation's website. They're stating, and this is probably it's June 30th, $18.8 billion in the earnings reserve of the Permanent Fund. That's all relatively liquid assets that the state can access. So, you know, all the state has to do is reduce its budget to a sustainable level. That's the hard part. I say all. And it can ride out this storm without any new taxes. $18.8 billion, and oil's at what, $85 a barrel now? So, anyway.
Additional discussion on the motion to remove the sales or income tax item from the list. I don't see any, so clerk, let's vote.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lawrence.
No.
Ms. Dodge. Mr. Gray.
No.
Ms. Major.
Yes.
Mr. Roberts.
Yes.
Mr. Lejewski.
Yes.
Mr. Quist.
No.
Mr. Cooper.
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
3-5.
it fails 3-5. And I'll note that there will be many more bites at this apple. Mr. Roberts.
So I want to move to delete on page 39, excuse me, page 40, the last paragraph, remove marijuana from the schedule of controlled substances.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, so Mr. Roberts has moved, Mr. Lejewski has seconded a motion to make a recommendation to the Capital Projects and Legislative Priorities Committee to remove the last paragraph on page 40, which is a request to remove marijuana from the schedule of controlled substances. Mr. Roberts.
So I'd probably be fine with this if it was to move it up the schedule. But realistically, like a lot of these other scratched out paragraphs, obviously we haven't been able to sell this the last few years that it's been on our priority list. And so I'm not so sure you're going to find any more interest this year on it either. So I think we should remove it and focus on much more important things.
Additional discussion? This item, this motion? Dodge, Mr. Quist.
Ms. Dolan, can you speak to the challenge? It seems like we ran into challenges with this request because it was more complicated than apparent initially. Would you speak to that?
Sure. So it looks like you can just do a one-line amendment to Title 11 that just removes it, but you really can't because that references a whole lot of other implications, for instance, CDLs and other issues, other regulatory requirements. So there were a lot of conforming amendments that had to go with it. I believe there was a bill that was in draft that was never introduced, and it was something like 56 pages or something that did all of that, but when nothing moved in the legislature last year, nothing's happened with it. So that's kind of where it's at. And I think it's kind of agreed that really the state should be taking the lead on this, and that we should, I think the administration was just recommending that we be a support role.
Mr. Quist.
Thank you. So I would speak against this motion. I think that it is important at some point that the state do remove this from the schedule of controlled substances. I believe it's the only item on 6A or Schedule 6 in the first place. We have, the status of cannabis has changed. It's no longer illegal. Now it's a regulated substance, and I think that it would make sense for the statute to change to reflect that. And, you know, and personally, you know, the committee will have a recommendation, and then we'll have an opportunity to look at this as well. You know, although I do feel that it is very important, and I also feel that it's, you know, incongruous with the current state of law. Otherwise, taking a supporting role on it, I think, is appropriate, and you know, not a lead role. It's something that the state should do, but that we should encourage. Thank you.
Thanks. Additional discussion on the motion. Wojcicki?
I just had 2 cups of drugs, caffeine here, so I feel like a hypocrite if I voted yes, so I'll vote no.
All right, additional discussion on this motion. Seeing none, clerk, let's vote.
All right, thank you. Ms. Dodge?
No.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Wojcicki?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
No.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
1-7.
motion fails 1-7. Additional discussion on items in the legislative priorities list. Ms. Major?
I'd like to make a motion to delete the PFD payment disbursement should the FNSB Assembly take a formal position.
Okay, that is on page 42. Is moved by Ms. Major, seconded by Mr. Roberts. Yep. To delete the paragraph on the top of page 42 that reads PFD payment disbursement should the FNSB Assembly take a formal position. This is new this year. Ms. Major, do you want to speak to the motion?
Sure, and so we did talk about this in the committee. I think there's a number of reasons why it should stay the same or stay as it is. One, the administrative cost to the state government to manage a program that would send out frequent checks, whether it's quarterly or monthly, the amount of people that it would take to manage that program. Just the administrative cost in its entirety, as well as then the impact that it would have on municipalities who also have some collections on PFDs for debt. I just don't think that this is really something that we should go after at this time.
Thank you. Additional comment, Mr. Roberts?
Yeah, I'd point out that this is one of the best states as far as if you're a landlord in a position of someone who's not paying their rent and skips out on you, is that instead of having to track them down, if they stayed in state, you can garnish from the PFD. And I do think that would really change if you had a monthly one. I'm not sure how you'd work that out. I mean, I'm not saying it couldn't be worked out, but it's more complicated. And certainly, as was pointed out, it's going to be more expensive for this program.
Mr. Quist, then Ms. Dodge.
Thank you. So I would speak against this motion. So I made the motion to add this to the list in our committee meeting, partly based upon a concern that turns out to be a bit overblown. I had been informed that that some people, particularly folks on SNAP, and it turns out it doesn't apply in that specific situation, when they would receive their PFD that month, it could cause them to no longer qualify for that benefit, and that turns out not to be the case. It may be the case in some other situations, and I can't speak to those details at the moment. I think that the program, regardless of that, may make some sense, and that I feel that the topic is at least worth exploring, and that's, you know, we haven't had an opportunity to have the conversation. It was just added at the end of our last meeting, and we're going to have the idea is to have a robust discussion a week from today at noon at our next committee meeting, and to speak to the, you know, some of the concerns about the costs, or how, very briefly, how it might impact the borough or landlords from being able to recoup monies. Well, so I would imagine that in order to be able to qualify for the program, that you would have to, you know, be entitled to the full amount of your dividend, or that, you know, this is something that would happen after October. So instead of getting that whole thing right then, you know, it's something that can be done out over the year. I mean, I don't really see that impacting necessarily impacting this RIT process in some kind of catastrophic way. Obviously, that would be considered. And then as far as the administrative cost, clearly that there would be some, but governments, ours in particular, are, you know, very good at issuing checks on large scales to people. It's one thing that government tends to be actually very good at. And just, you could think about this as an opportunity for the state to sit on that money that much longer. Anybody who chooses to opt into the program, effectively the state's going to be sitting on their PFD for an extra 6 months. That allows the state to use that as part of our sovereign wealth in order to get interest and fund other government programs. So I see this as potentially giving more flexibility to people and generating more revenue for the state. And is just the very beginning of the conversation. So I would urge us not to try to squish it before we've even looked into it more. Thank you.
Additional discussion on this, Mr. Lajewski, then Mr. Lawrence.
I'm just wondering to myself if that was going to push someone over the income for the month, if they could just deposit a certain portion of it to go below into a traditional IRA or something, and just, I don't know, I just wonder if there's already a solution to that.
Ms. Dolan looks like she has a...
So as far as SNAP benefits go, you do lose your eligibility for SNAP benefits, but PFD division issues what they call a hold harmless payment. So they actually make you whole for the benefits that you lose. So there is no loss to the recipient.
Mr. Lawrence, then Mr. Roberts.
You know, I'm not sure how I'm going to vote on this. I was tending to vote yes until Mr. Quist spoke. This is a recommendation to the committee, so I want the committee to know that I don't feel strongly either way on this. I don't mind this being looked at more if there is a practical way of administering it that doesn't have consequences or expenses that are disproportionate to the benefit. So I may vote yes, but I may not, but I don't feel strongly about it, and but I do think we need the committee, and then the future assembly needs a lot more information than we have tonight before you do take a position.
Mr. Roberts.
So I think just by the fact of all the questions that were coming up about all the possibilities, that this is really a legislative issue. And us getting into it shows that it's probably not our issue if we don't already have a firm idea of where we want it to go. And maybe we should let the new batch of legislators figure out what kind of laws they want to do, and we can really focus on what the Fairbanks North Star Borough directly needs. So, I think we're really crossing the line, getting into other territory there.
Mr. Quist.
Thank you. So if this comes back in front of the next assembly and it isn't concrete and it doesn't make sense, I would be surprised if it didn't get removed. All we're asking, what's on the table in front of us right now, is a motion to tell this committee to basically not even continue to consider this. And we're just now starting the conversation, and I don't see how it exceeds our scope. I don't see why it's inappropriate for us to do that. I would encourage this body to not discourage that body to look into it more. And when it comes back in front of us, if we don't like it, we'll have something more substantial to disagree upon and you know, and or to dislike, and we'll have some of our questions answered. We might have some new questions and hopefully answers to those questions as well. But I mean, all we're doing is talking about this, and we have multiple times going forward to squish it. If we're gonna squish it, let's do it later with more information. Thank you.
To have Ms. Major, then Mr. Lawrence.
So I actually want to address kind of the comments that Mr. Quist brought up because, and I think it relates a bit to what Mr. Roberts said as well. We don't even know if this is a real issue yet, right? And I think that there are lots of other venues and forums for this type of problem definition or issue definition to be discovered and looked at and perhaps brought forward next year in the legislative priorities. But I think given the importance of this work, the limited time that the committee has over the next couple of weeks or over the course of time, I do not believe that there's a value in administrative cost or time, whether it's staff time or committee time, to trying to identify whether or not there's even a problem even exists to go after it. So I think there are probably lots of other forums where that could happen, and when there's something more concrete, bring it forward to the committee.
All right, Mr. Lawrence.
Well, I'll just, point out that this legislative priorities, priorities, it's our opportunity as a legislative body to express an opinion or take a position to communicate to the legislature. And I think the legislature needs as much input as possible in determining, what it's going to do. And, citizens have a right to contact, and lobbyists will have input. But, I've got, in principle, I'm not sure what about this particular issue. I'm not, I've got a feeling Ms. Major is correct that we're not going to have enough, information for the, in this short of a time to really take a position. But in principle, that's the whole point of this, is to tell the legislature what we think they should do on state issues. And the legislature needs to hear from municipal legislative bodies, as much as anybody. So in principle, I'm in favor of what we're doing right now and telling them what we think.
I have Mr. Quist and Ms. Major.
Thank you. Just briefly, I don't think that any of these specific recommendations need to be exhaustive in their legal scope. Clearly, the one that we just decided not to recommend removing, about cannabis as a controlled substance, that one sentence does not encompass the scope of the 56-page draft that would likely, be a vehicle for its implementation. And so just as this wouldn't encompass the law for the whole program. But so that being said, the only other thing that I would reiterate is, regardless of there being a negative impact upon people's benefits that we're trying to mitigate, let's say that's not an issue, I still see this as potentially being something that increases the level of service for residents and is revenue positive for the state. That's at least a possibility in my mind, and I think is worth exploring more. Thank you.
Ms. Major?
So I don't disagree with Mr. Lawrence, right, that this is our opportunity to tell the state legislator to tell the state government what to look at, right? I just don't think that this is the right time. I think that, this was brought forward to the committee based off really an anecdotal piece of information that hasn't really proven to be factual. So what problem are we trying to solve? What problem are we asking the state to solve? What is the issue? We don't know. So my recommendation would be spend some time understanding, as an assembly member or as members of the assembly, understanding what the issue is, defining the issue, and bringing it forward to the committee next year once there's more definition, so we can focus our work on things that are absolutely critical to what the borough needs this year.
Mr. Quist?
So I feel like I need to reiterate this because of the question that Ms. Major just asked. So regardless of a problem, so in my initial remarks on this, I said that, the problem that first brought this to my attention turned out to be overblown. But regardless of that, I see it as, increasing the level of service for people and potentially being revenue positive. And all we're asking for is the ability to continue investigating it, and then there'll be a recommendation one way or the other, at some later time. Thank you.
Additional discussion on this item, Mr. Lawrence.
Well, it's my understanding that this Finance Committee, all it's doing now is making recommendations. So even if we recommend that this particular priority be deleted, that doesn't mean the Capital Projects Committee can't ignore our recommendation, and the next assembly can do what it wants to do with it.
I was going to make that point that even if we voted to recommend taking it off the list, it's not off the list until the Capital Projects Committee takes it off the list. So, yeah, Mr.
And if I could just speak to that, I guess the reason, and I understand that it's on the agenda for a week from today regardless,
Yep.
but I guess I would urge the Assembly to not speak against ideas with promise without all the information. And I'm not married to this idea. I think it has some potential, and I think it's worth talking about more. So I'm reluctant to disrecommend it at this point, given that we have a lot of questions still. Thank you.
Thanks. Additional discussion on this motion. Ms. Major.
And I just want to re-add and reiterate that I don't think that this committee is the appropriate place to do all of that discovery learning, that I think that there's a lot of other types of venues and forums to do that, and bring this back to the committee when there is a better understanding of the problem and what it is that we would be asking the state to do about it.
Additional discussion? Mr. Gray.
Well, I'll just add that we keep talking, or I keep hearing about it being only a problem, whereas I think that we're talking about that there are a lot of potential benefits. So I think that it's not just exploring a problem, but exploring potential benefits. That's all.
Mr. Quist, did you have?
I'm all right. Thank you.
Okay. Additional discussion on this item. This motion, Mr. Roberts.
So, building on that perspective, in this kind of time frame that we're talking about, where in November we've got to approve and then present to our legislatures either in late November, early December, I don't think it's possible, based on the amount of information needed, to present a good case. And we always have to work on minimizing our asks, because they've got so much to do. As you see, a lot of the stuff we ask for, we can't get any play with. And so it's always best to focus on what's really important and really relevant to the borough in a way that only the state can help us out. We should really be much more specific when we're doing these legislative asks, like the PERS TERS things. That's something we have to fix at the state level, and they can help us out.
Additional discussion on this motion, which is to remove PFD payment disbursement from the legislative priorities list. I don't see any, so clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
Thank you. Mr. Lawrence.
Yes.
Mr. Lejeski.
Yes.
Ms. Major.
Yes.
Ms. Dodge.
Yes.
Mr. Roberts.
Yes.
Mr. Gray.
No.
Mr. Quist.
No.
Mr. Cooper.
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
5-3.
5-3. The motion, I'm used to saying the motion failed. The motion is adopted to remove PFD payment disbursement from the legislative priorities list as a not to remove it, the recommendation of the Finance Committee for the Capital Projects Committee to remove it. All right, Mr. Roberts.
So I just want to make a comment, definitely not a motion on this, because we've already got that in something and talked about it enough. But when I look at the state capital budget, and of course, there's definitely been talk of getting that increased. One of the projects I'm going to be pushing for when I talk to our state people is that they use capital money to help us put ESPs in. and that they make that part of the capital budget, and we get it through that mechanism, because that's going to help us a lot more than a new bridge that can wait another year.
Any additional comments on the legislative priorities section of the legislative priorities list? Seeing none, I think that takes us to the end of our discussion on these two lists for now. I reiterate, for now, because we'll be having one more capital project committee is going to have a fun meeting, and then we're going to have another finance committee meeting to hear about it, and then the assembly is going to have to adopt it in November. So we'll be debating all of these things again, minus a few members, so and plus a few new members. So that takes us next under other committee business and discussion items to monthly budget reports and general fund updated fund balance reports. Any questions or discussions on those items? Seeing none, we'll go to Mayor and Assembly member comments on finance-related items. Mayor Castle, any finance committee-related topics, comments?
Oh yeah, I've got some good news and some embarrassing news that are connected to each other. So I brought forward an ordinance that was overwhelmingly supported by the Assembly, and we designated $50,000 to go into the Joint Use Fieldhouse project with Fort Wainwright to do a feasibility and implementation plan, including an agreement that was a final version of the agreement. And since then, the good news is, well, I guess the embarrassing news is, forget that we did that. And the $50,000 is going to stay in the general fund. But that's good news that we get to keep our 50 grand for now. The folks out at Fort Wainwright have split the project into two things, a feasibility study and an implementation plan, because we don't necessarily do an implementation plan if the feasibility study fails, right? And so Fort Wainwright has graciously offered to fund the entire feasibility plan. So it's no cost to us. Their foot in the whole bill. We'll get through the feasibility plan, and then should it prove feasible, we will go to the implementation plan phase, and some other mayor will be before you asking for the $50,000 back to put into the implementation plan. So anyway, that's where we are, and I think it's good news overall. Just a little embarrassing how we got to where we are, but it's good stuff, and it's still a good project, so we'll see it through.
Thanks. Any questions for the mayor on this one? Mr. Lawrence?
Now, this feasibility plan, I mean, the borough will participate in that, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We're still, nothing's changed on the project at all. It's just that we've kind of split it, because if the feasibility study shows that we don't want to do it, the agreement we had written included doing both things, and we were funding part of both of it. You know what happens is those attorneys get involved, and they say, you know what, you got a problem here, because if you decide to not do the implementation plan, your MOU says you're funding part of the implementation plan, but you're not going to do it, and so we got some issues here. So we had to agree with the attorneys. Sometimes they're right. They were right in this case. And we had to split things up into two projects, which isn't a big deal. I mean, it's not a big deal at all. And I won't say exactly how the upper level administration at Fort Wainwright felt about it, but I think maybe they were as equally embarrassed as I, and said, you know what, we're just going to fund the feasibility part of this ourselves. You guys just, be part of the project still. We're not changing any of that at all. The whole charrette's all the same, and it's still full speed ahead. It's a high priority for everybody to see where we can go with this and study all the options. So really no change other than Fort Wainwright's picking up the first part of the tab, and if we want to continue into the second phase, then the expectation is we'll come back and ask for some funding then to whoever's sitting in the assembly seats.
All right. Any other questions for the mayor on finance topics? Thank you, Mayor. On assembly member comments on finance-related issues, I'll start down at this end with Ms. Major.
None, thank you.
Mr. Roberts? None. Mr. Quist?
No comment, thank you.
Mr. Lejeski?
The night where we approved money for the joint, I forget the correct terminology of it, the joint facility feasibility plan and implementation, I'd leave early. I would have voted yes if I was here. And I'll just say about that, I really hope it ends up coming up with a joint pool. That's my hope.
Thank you, Mr. Lejeski. Mr. Gray?
No comment.
Mr. Lawrence.
I have no comment.
Ms. Dodge. I'll just say I enjoyed listening to the robust conversation tonight on a variety of topics. It was actually, I think, a pretty good Finance Committee conversation, so thank you. Finance Committee is adjourned.
All right, Committee of the Whole will